The secrets of global navigation were once hidden within the temperature-controlled chambers of a clockmaker's workshop. Every gear pulse had to remain indifferent to the storm's fury through delicate, microscopic calibration. Settle in as we explore the boring, beautiful details of 18th century engineering designed to conquer the high seas. Welcome back, traveler, to Boring History, a quiet corner of the world where we leave behind the noise of today and gently wander into the stillness of the past. Here, the fires of history burn low and steady, casting long shadows over forgotten stories. We are not here for kings and conquests, but for the quiet, strange, and sometimes unsettling moments that time nearly buried. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. Segment 1. The weight of a second. The sea does not forgive imprecision. This is not a metaphor, not a sailor's proverb dressed up to sound wiser than it is. It is a statement of mechanical fact. As reliable as the behavior of water under pressure or the angle at which light refracts through salt spray at dawn, the sea operates according to physics, and physics does not negotiate. A reef does not move because a captain believed himself to be somewhere other than where he was. A shoal does not soften because the tide tables were misread, or the clock was slow, or the man responsible for knowing the time had been careless during the night watch. The ocean is indifferent in the most complete sense of the word, and it was into the grammar of that indifference that Elias Wren was born. He came from Harwich, on the English coast, where the North Sea makes its intentions plain. The town was not beautiful in any conventional sense. It was grey and practical, organized around the logic of departure and arrival. Its streets laid out not for wandering but for the efficient movement of cargo and men between ships and warehouses, and the particular kind of tavern that stays open at hours when decent establishments are long dark. The smell of the place was salt and tar and fish and the specific cold that comes off open water in November. A cold that gets into wool and stays there, that Wren could still conjure in his memory decades later simply by closing his eyes in a warm room. His father was a pilot, one of those men who knew the local waters so thoroughly that they could be put aboard an unfamiliar ship in darkness and fog and bring her safely through channels that would baffle any chart. Piloting was knowledge of a specific and bodily kind, accumulated over years of passage until it lived not in the mind but in the hands and feet, in the way a man felt the deck beneath him and listened to the sound of water changing as the depth changed. Wren's father could not have explained most of what he knew in words, and he never tried. He showed his son instead, took him out in the small harbour boat from the time Wren could sit upright, pointed at things, named currents by sound, indicated the particular shade of green that meant shallow water and the particular quality of silence before a squall. He was teaching the boy to read, but not from books. Wren's mother was from a family of watchmakers in Colchester, which meant that the boy grew up in a household where two kinds of precision were represented, and where the dinner-table conversation sometimes touched on the relationship between them. His father had no patience for theoretical discussion. He was a man of demonstrated competence, suspicious of any knowledge that could not be tested against the actual water, but he understood, in the pragmatic way of men who regularly faced the consequences of errors, that knowing the time mattered. He had seen ships come to grief on coasts they should have cleared by miles, and he knew, in broad terms, why. They had not known where they were, and they had not known where they were because they had not known the time. It was his mother who explained the mechanism of that failure in detail, patiently, over several evenings when Wren was perhaps 11 or 12, using a clock from her father's collection that she kept on the mantel, a beautiful instrument in a walnut case, with a white enamel face and a movement she could describe, component by component. She explained longitude. She drew diagrams on the back of paper used for household accounts, showing the globe and the meridians running down it like lines on a peeled orange, showing how the sun moved through 15 degrees every hour, and what that meant for a man in the middle of the ocean who needed to know which meridian he was standing on. She explained that the problem had been understood for more than a century before anyone solved it, that the solution had taken a carpenter's son from Lincolnshire most of his adult life, and that the instrument that had finally made it possible, the marine chronometer, was in her informed opinion the most beings had ever made. Wren listened with the quality of attention that certain children bring to certain subjects, total and self-conscious, laying the information down in layers that would stay undisturbed for a lifetime. He did not know, at 11, that he would spend his professional life among chronometers. He knew only that the story his mother was telling him was important, and that it connected the two worlds of his childhood, the technical world of her family's workshop and the physical world of his father's water, in a way that felt, to him, like a key fitting a lock he hadn't known existed. He went to sea at 14, as boys did, as deckhand on a coastal trader working the routes between Harwich and the ports of the Humber estuary. He learned ropes and rigging and the mechanics of seamanship with the same comprehensive attention he had given his mother's explanations, and over the years that followed he worked his way through the hierarchies of merchant vessels, from deckhand to able seaman to boatswain's mate, acquiring certificates and competencies and the kind of unspectacular but genuine competence that earned a man trust aboard ships. He never stopped being interested in the navigation. He was always, at some level, watching the officers work their sights, noting how they read the chronometers, filing away observations about the relationship between the instruments and the positions they produced. By his 21st year he had obtained a mate's certificate and could navigate competently with the instruments available to him. But competence nagged at him. He understood what the chronometer did well enough to use it, but he did not understand it. Not in the way his mother had understood the movement behind the walnut case face. Not in the way that would allow him to know, rather than merely believe, whether the numbers it gave him could be trusted. This distinction mattered to Wren in a way he found difficult to explain to colleagues who considered a working instrument and a working knowledge of the calculation sufficient for the purpose. He was not wrong that it was sufficient, most of the time. He simply could not make himself comfortable with most of the time. It was a former captain of his, a methodical Scot named Craigie, who had spent 20 years on the eastern routes and had opinions about everything, who first mentioned Pieter Voss. They were in a dockside office in Leith, going over charts for a forthcoming passage to the Baltic, and Wren had made some remark about one of the ship's chronometers, a note of uncertainty about its recent performance that Craigie received with more seriousness than Wren had expected. "You should go to Voss," Craigie said, as if resuming a conversation they had not, in fact, been having, in Amsterdam. "If you want to understand these instruments rather than just use them." Wren said he had heard the name but did not know the man's work. "He's the best in Europe," Craigie said simply, and returned to the chart, which was his way of indicating that a subject had been exhausted. Wren spent 2 more years thinking about it. The thinking was not indecisive. It was the kind of accumulation that eventually tips over into action without drama, the way water rises in a lock. He saved money, investigated Voss's reputation through the network of merchant captains and shipping agents who were his professional world, and found that Craigie's assessment was broadly shared. Voss was described as difficult, demanding, and without interest in students who were not serious. He was also described as transformative, a word that appeared often enough, from enough different sources, to be believed. Wren arrived in Amsterdam on a Tuesday in October, having crossed from Harwich on a packet boat in weather that was unremarkable by the standards of the North Sea in autumn. He found the workshop on the Herringgracht by asking directions 3 times. Which was 2 more times than he would have needed if he had been able to read Dutch street signs with any confidence. And he arrived at the door with his bag and a letter of introduction from a Dutch merchant captain, who had worked with Craigie and who Voss apparently respected. He stood outside for a moment before knocking. He could hear the clocks. He had not expected to hear them through the door. He had imagined a workshop as he had imagined workshops generally, as places where noise was made, where the sounds of manufacture and tool use would have covered any mechanical ticking. But the door was not thick, and what came through it was unmistakable, a layered, complex sound, many instruments ticking in close proximity, their individual rhythms slightly different in tempo and character, producing together something that was almost musical. He stood on the canal side step and listened to it for perhaps 30 seconds before he knocked, and later he would say that those 30 seconds were, in some way he couldn't fully account for, the beginning of his real education. Voss opened the door himself. He was smaller than Wren had imagined, thin and slightly stooped, somewhere in his early 60s, with close-cropped white hair and the kind of face that gave very little away. He looked at Wren's letter without visible enthusiasm, read it without visible reaction, and then looked up at Wren with eyes that were sharp and assessing in a way that made Wren feel, briefly, like a movement being evaluated for tolerances. "You have been at sea," Voss said. It was not a question. "Yes, 11 years you can navigate." "Yes, then you do not need to learn to navigate." He handed the letter back. "Come in." The workshop was exactly as the sound through the door had suggested. A long, low-ceilinged room lit by large windows facing the canal, with workbenches running along both walls, and, along the inner wall, the shelf of chronometers in their boxes. The smell Wren noticed immediately: brass and oil and something clean, almost medicinal. The sound, inside the room, was more complex and more beautiful than it had been through the door. The ticking of perhaps 20 instruments layering into a consensus that had, as Wren stood still and listened, a kind of texture to it, a depth. "Close the door," Voss said, already moving toward his bench. Wren closed the door and stood in the ticking room, with his bag, in the city where he knew no one. At the beginning of the thing he had come to do, he did not feel nervous, which surprised him slightly. He felt, more than anything, that he was in the right place, which was a sensation he recognized from the sea. From those moments when a course correction proved out, and the coast appeared where the calculations said it would, and the numbers and the reality agreed. "You will sleep above," Voss said, gesturing vaguely upward. "You will eat when there is food. You will not touch any instrument on that shelf without my instruction." He picked up a loop and fitted it to his eye, and bent over the movement on his bench without looking up again. "Sit there. Watch what I do. Say nothing." Wren sat. He watched. He said nothing. "A ship that does not know the time," Voss said, after perhaps 20 minutes, still without looking up, his fingers moving with their extraordinary unhurried certainty over the mechanism before him, "does not know where it is. And a ship that does not know where it is." He breathed on a small gear and polished it against his apron. "Set it aside with precision, is already lost." It was the first lesson. It was also, Wren would come to understand, the only lesson. Everything else that followed over the next 3 years was elaboration of that central statement, expansion and complication and refinement of the idea that time, precisely known, was the difference between orientation and catastrophe, between a ship that knew its place in the world and a ship that was simply moving through darkness, hoping the darkness was empty. The weight of a second. Wren had not understood it, not truly, until he stood in that room and heard 20 chronometers ticking in unison and felt, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, how much was carried in that sound. Not merely the agreement of mechanisms, not merely the accumulated craft of makers and regulators and the long intellectual tradition that had produced these instruments. Something more essential than any of that. The weight of every voyage that depended on this ticking being true. Every ship that had navigated successfully because a clock had been set correctly and maintained carefully and trusted with the appropriate combination of confidence and skepticism. Every cargo delivered, every crew returned, every position fixed against the curved indifference of the earth. He had come to learn a skill. What he found, in that first hour in Voss's workshop, was that the skill was inseparable from a particular quality of seriousness. A recognition that the margin between precision and imprecision was not abstract, but geographical, not theoretical, but measured in the distance between a ship's believed position and its actual one, in the rocks that appeared where open water was supposed to be, in the ledgers of insurance companies and the notifications sent to families in port towns. Voss worked for another hour without speaking again, and the room ticked around them both, and Wren sat very still and began the process of becoming the kind of man who understood what he was hearing. Segment 2. The problem of longitude. Before the marine chronometer, the sea swallowed ships with a casual cruelty that men of the age had, to a remarkable degree, simply accepted. This acceptance was not indifference. The losses were mourned, the men remembered, the cargoes grieved by those who had invested in them, but it had something of the quality of a tax, an understood cost, built into the arithmetic of ambition, paid regularly enough that the payment had acquired a kind of normalcy. Ships went out. Some came back. The ones that did not were added to lists that existed in harbourmasters' offices and underwriters' ledgers, and, in less formal but more lasting form, in the collective memory of port towns, where certain names of ships and routes and seasons became shorthand for a kind of danger that everyone understood and no one had yet solved. The problem was longitude, and it had been understood as a problem, as a specific, definable, solvable in principle problem, since before Columbus. This was one of its more maddening qualities. Unlike many of the obstacles that faced maritime expansion, the longitude problem was not mysterious. No one was confused about what was needed. The nature of the difficulty had been articulated clearly by scholars and navigators for more than 2 centuries before its solution arrived. The problem was not that no one knew what was required. The problem was that what was required seemed, for a very long time, to be beyond what human ingenuity could produce. To understand why, it helps to understand what could already be done. Latitude, a ship's north-south position on the globe, was navigable with instruments and methods that, while demanding skill and good weather, were fundamentally achievable. The principle was simple. The angle of the sun or the stars above the horizon changed predictably with latitude. At the equator, the noon sun was directly overhead on the equinoxes. In higher latitudes it was lower in the sky. A navigator with a quadrant or, later, a sextant could measure the angle of the noon sun, consult a table of solar declinations for the date, and calculate his latitude with a reliability that, in competent hands, was genuinely impressive. The method had been understood since antiquity. By the 15th century, European navigators were using it routinely, and the instruments for making the measurement had been refined to a point where skilled practitioners could determine their latitude to within a few miles. Longitude was a different category of problem entirely. The Earth rotates, which means that the position of any celestial object in the sky is not determined solely by your latitude, but by a combination of your latitude and the time. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west, because the Earth turns beneath it. The moment of local noon, the moment when the sun reaches its highest point in the sky, occurs at different times at different longitudes, because each longitude is facing the sun at a different moment. This is the connection between time and longitude. They are, in a profound sense, the same thing. Longitude, east or west, is simply a measure of how far around the rotating Earth you are from some reference point. And since the Earth rotates 15 degrees per hour, 1 hour of time difference corresponds to 15 degrees of longitude difference. 4 minutes of time equals 1 degree of longitude. If you knew the time at a fixed reference point, a prime meridian, chosen arbitrarily but maintained consistently, and you knew your local time determinable from the sun, the difference between the two gave you your longitude directly. The mathematics were elementary. The problem was the if. Knowing the time at a distant reference point, when you were weeks or months of sailing away from it, required bringing that time with you, required a clock that could run for months aboard a ship, in conditions of violent motion, extreme temperature variation, humidity, and salt air, without losing or gaining more than a few seconds per day, because a few seconds per day, compounded over a month, was the difference between an accurate position and an error of tens or hundreds of miles. And tens or hundreds of miles, in the wrong waters, was the difference between arrival and catastrophe. The longitude problem, framed this way, is really a clock-making problem. It was understood as such by the natural philosophers of the 17th century, including Galileo and Huygens, both of whom proposed solutions based on portable clocks, and both of whom confronted the fundamental difficulty. The pendulum clocks of their era, however accurate on land, were useless at sea. A pendulum depends on gravity for its regulation, and a ship in motion is a place where effective gravity is constantly changing direction and magnitude. Put a pendulum clock on a vessel in open water, and it will gain and lose time with every wave, its accuracy destroyed by the very medium it was supposed to navigate. Even setting the pendulum problem aside, the precision required was extraordinary. A clock that lost just 1 second per day would, over a 60-day voyage, accumulate a minute of error, and 1 minute of time was 15 miles of longitude at the equator. 15 miles could put a ship on a reef it thought it had cleared by a comfortable margin. The institutional recognition of the problem reached its peak in 1714, when the British Parliament passed the Longitude Act, establishing a prize of £20,000, a sum equivalent to several million in contemporary values for any practical method of determining longitude at sea to within half a degree. The prize attracted cranks and visionaries in roughly equal measure, along with a smaller number of serious investigators who understood the genuine difficulty of what was being asked. Among the latter was a self-educated carpenter and joiner from Lincolnshire named John Harrison, who began working on the problem in the 1720s and who would, in the end, devote more than 4 decades to it, producing in the process a series of instruments that transformed not just navigation but the entire discipline of precision clockmaking. Harrison's approach was mechanical rather than astronomical. The competing approach, favored by the astronomers who dominated the board of longitude, the body charged with administering the prize, was to use the moon as a clock face. The moon moves against the background of stars at a predictable rate, and by measuring the lunar distance, the angle between the moon and a reference star, a navigator could, in principle, determine Greenwich time without a clock at all. The method was theoretically sound, and was refined, during the 18th century, into something practically useful, published as tables in the Nautical Almanac, beginning in 1767. But the lunar distance method required long and complex calculations, clear skies, and a level of mathematical competence that not every ship's officer possessed. It was a solution, but not a universal one. Harrison's clocks were a different kind of solution. His first three instruments, H1, H2, and H3, produced over 30 years, were large, complex mechanisms incorporating a series of innovations designed to compensate for the effects of temperature, humidity, and motion. They worked, to varying degrees, but they were expensive, delicate, and difficult to replicate. His fourth instrument, the H4, completed in 1759, was something entirely different, a large pocket watch, 5 inches in diameter, elegantly made, incorporating a temperature compensation mechanism and a high-frequency escapement that made it far more resistant to the effects of motion than any previous design. When tested on a voyage to Jamaica in 1761, the H4 lost just 5 seconds over 81 days, an error of less than 1 minute of longitude, well within the prize requirements. The board of Longitude, dominated by men who had invested their professional reputations in the lunar distance method and who were by temperament suspicious of a working-class craftsman with no formal scientific training, did not accept this result gracefully. Harrison spent years fighting for recognition that should have been his by right of achievement, a story that has since become one of the more famous examples of institutional obstruction in the history of science. He eventually received most of the prize money, piecemeal and grudgingly, after intervention by the king. He was in his late 70s by then. What matters for the history of navigation, and for the tradition that Pieter Voss represented, and that Elias Wren came to Amsterdam to learn, is not the political struggle, but the technical legacy. Harrison's H4 demonstrated that a reliable marine timekeeper was possible, and it provided a template, not literally, since his mechanisms were not simply reproducible by other hands, but conceptually, for the generation of craftsmen who followed him. The most important of these was John Arnold, and after Arnold, Thomas Earnshaw, who between them developed the designs, particularly the spring detent escapement and the compensation balance that became the basis for the mass production, such as it was, of marine chronometers in the 19th century. By Voss's time, the chronometer had been refined to a point of sophistication that Harrison would have recognized as his inheritance, but perhaps not fully anticipated. But precise equipment, but precision relatives, and serious ocean-going. Wishes is, in a second of session of gishente, and a secature, in the second kippichust, in a saxxeb sikik selects kennet, kin gopin kin guipin, gan kikong, conquets ken with power go with pab, with whoopka, puffcat will play. Auf without huska sak wouldn't bow cup up off all up I caspit up I'll cock what off ska off our the fuck a couple go cast couple was so moves cup cast the go just what had not changed was the fundamental dependence on care. The chronometer was not self-maintaining. It required winding on a precise schedule daily, at the same time each day, to keep the mainspring tension as consistent as possible. It required protection from extreme temperature changes and from shock. It required regular comparison against known time signals to track its rate and correct for any drift. And it required, above all, a navigator who understood what the instrument could and could not do, who knew that it was not infallible, that it had a personality and a rate that had to be understood and accounted for, that trusting it blindly was only marginally less dangerous than not having it at all. This was what Voss taught, and what Harrison had understood intuitively before the formal tradition existed to articulate it, that the chronometer was a partnership. The instrument provided consistency. The navigator provided understanding. The instrument carried the time. The navigator interpreted it. Between them, properly maintained and properly used, they could place a ship within a few miles of its true position anywhere on the ocean. Separately, or paired with ignorance or carelessness, they were nothing. Wren learned the history slowly, in pieces, over his years in Amsterdam, from Voss's occasional remarks, from the books in Voss's small library, from conversations with other craftsmen and the occasional visiting navigator who came to have instruments rated or repaired. He assembled the story the way he had learned to assemble movements, piece by piece, each component understood before it was placed, until the whole mechanism was legible. He came to feel the longitude problem not as history, but as present reality, as the condition that made every chronometer in Voss's workshop important. The problem that every instrument on that shelf was, in its own ticking way, the answer to. The sea that had swallowed ships for centuries still existed. The reefs and shoals and unlit coasts were still there. The indifference of the ocean had not changed. What had changed was the human capacity to move through it with orientation, to know, with reasonable confidence, where the ship was on the turning globe. This capacity rested on the chronometer, and the chronometer rested on the care of men like Voss, and the care of men like Voss rested on a tradition that ran back through Arnold and Earnshaw and Harrison to the original recognition that time and longitude were the same thing, and that the solution to the oldest problem in navigation was to find a way to carry time aboard a ship without losing a single crucial second of it. Wren wound the workshop chronometers every morning under Voss's supervision, and later under his own authority. He felt, each time he did it, the length of the chain he was part of, the centuries of loss and problem and effort and eventual solution that the simple act of winding represented. It was a brief and daily ritual. It was also, he came to believe, one of the most important things a person could do. Segment 3. Master Voss and his workshop. Pieter Voss did not look like a man who held lives in his hands, which was perhaps the first and most misleading thing about him. He was small, not merely short but compact, as if some process of reduction had been applied to him, leaving the essential without the excess. Slightly stooped, with a deliberate quality to his movements that could be mistaken, by someone who did not know him, for slowness. He was not slow. He was precise, which is a different thing entirely. And the difference mattered in exactly the way it mattered in the instruments he spent his life calibrating. A clock that moves slowly is losing time. A clock that moves precisely is keeping it. His hands were the most immediately remarkable thing about him. Wren noticed them in the first minutes, and never stopped noticing them over 3 years of daily proximity. They were long and narrow, with fingers that seemed to have been designed for a specific purpose, that purpose being the manipulation of objects too small and too consequential for ordinary hands. He could hold a mainspring between thumb and forefinger with a steadiness that had no relationship to effort or concentration. It was simply how his hands rested when they held things, the way some people's faces are naturally composed while others require composure. When he worked at the bench, his hands moved with a quality that Wren eventually found himself describing, in his journal, as predetermined, as if the movement had already occurred in some prior reality and was simply being enacted now, without the possibility of error or revision. He was 63 years old when Wren arrived, though he gave the impression of agelessness in the way that certain dedicated people do, their absorption in their work seeming to protect them from the depredations of passing time, or at least from the visible accumulation of it. He had worked in this workshop for 31 years. Before that, he had trained in Geneva, which was then and is now the other great center of the watchmaking tradition, under a master whose own training traced back through a genealogy of craft that Voss could recite, if he chose to, as other men recite family lineages, teacher and teachers, teacher and teachers, teacher's teacher, the inheritance of hand knowledge passing from person to person in a chain that had its own kind of integrity. He had never married. The workshop was his household, the instruments his primary relationships, and the daily rhythm of the work, the winding, the rating, the maintenance, the occasional new commission, his social world. This was not, Wren came to understand, loneliness. Voss was not lonely. He was complete. He had arranged his life around the thing that mattered to him, eliminating or never acquiring the elements that might have complicated that arrangement, and the result was a life of extraordinary coherence. Everything in the workshop served a purpose related to the work. Everything outside the workshop that Voss permitted: the daily walk along the canal in the late afternoon, the weekly dinner at a nearby establishment where he ate alone and read, the occasional long evening with a single bottle of Dutch gin and a technical treatise, served the same purpose by different means, providing the maintenance of the self that made continued work possible. The workshop itself bore the marks of this singularity of purpose. It was, in the most literal sense, organized, every tool in its place, every place labeled in Voss's small, extremely regular hand, every surface clear of anything that was not currently in use, not clean in the way of a room that is cleaned regularly, though it was that too, but organized in the way of a mind that cannot function amid disorder, where the arrangement of the physical space was a direct expression of the arrangement of thought. The workbenches were positioned to catch the north light from the canal-facing windows, which was the cool, consistent light that craftsmen preferred, without the directional shadows and color shifts that came with direct sun. The lamp oil was stored in a specific cabinet, the wicks trimmed on a specific schedule, the light supplemented during darker months, with additional lamps placed at angles Voss had worked out over years of adjusting and readjusting until he had maximized the visibility of the movements he worked on without inducing glare. The shelf of chronometers ran along the inner wall, away from the windows, away from direct light and the temperature variation that came with it. There were, on any given day, between 15 and 25 instruments on that shelf, their number varying depending on how many were in for service, how many had been recently completed and awaited delivery, how many were in the process of being rated. Each sat in its gimbaled mahogany box, and each box was closed when not being attended to, and each was numbered with a small ivory tag, and each number corresponded to an entry in the rating journal that Voss maintained with a regularity that would have seemed obsessive to anyone who did not understand what the journal represented. The sound of the shelf was the dominant feature of the room. It was not uniform ticking. Wren learned to hear, over weeks of listening, that each instrument had its own sonic character, determined by the frequency of its escapement, the mass of its balance, the tension of its spring. Some ticked with a crisp precision that had almost an aggressive quality to it, sharp and defined. Others had a softer beat, rounder in character, less emphatic. A few were at frequencies slightly different from the majority, and these stood out in the combined sound the way a slightly different instrument stands out in an ensemble, not discordantly, but distinctly. Voss could identify any instrument on the shelf by its sound alone. He demonstrated this for Wren early in the apprenticeship, standing in the middle of the room with his eyes closed, naming each one in turn as Wren opened boxes and pointed. He was never wrong. "This is the first skill," he said, when he had named them all. "Before you learn to set them, before you learn to regulate them, before you learn to repair them, you learn to hear them individually. A chronometer that is running incorrectly does not always show you its error in the numbers immediately. It tells you first in the sound, a slight irregularity in the beat, a variation in the rhythm. If you know the instrument, if you know what it sounds like when it is well, you will hear the problem before the rating confirms it." Wren asked how long it took to reach that level of familiarity. Voss considered the question with his characteristic absence of hurry. "For these instruments, as I know them, 30 years. For new instruments, under close attention, months. It depends on how well you listen." He was not warm, in any conventional sense. He did not ask about Wren's life, or history, or motivations, showed no interest in the social details that people generally use to establish relationship. He did not praise good work, he simply did not comment on it, which, Wren learned, was itself a form of commendation, since he commented immediately and specifically on errors. He explained things once, completely and without simplification, and did not offer to explain them again, on the apparent assumption that a person who had listened properly the first time did not require repetition. This was demanding, but it was also, in its way, respectful. It assumed a level of intelligence and attentiveness that obliged Wren to meet it, or at least to make the attempt. What Voss had, in place of warmth, was something more durable, absolute seriousness about the work. He did not treat any aspect of it as beneath attention or as routine in the sense of being automatic. The most repetitive task in the workshop, the daily winding and reading of the chronometers, received the same quality of attention. He brought to the delicate business of adjusting an escapement, not because it required the same level of skill, but because it mattered in the same way. A wind skipped, a reading recorded carelessly, a small variation in rate not noted, any of these could, in the chain of consequences that led from the workshop to the open sea, mean something. Voss could not make himself careless about things that might mean something. This was not a discipline he had acquired. It appeared to be constitutional. He had strong opinions about instruments and about the men who made them, offered without apparent concern for whether his interlocutor agreed. Harrison he respected without reservation. The H4 was, in his view, the most important single object in the history of navigation, and anyone who argued otherwise was either ignorant or dishonest. Earnshaw he admired for the spring detent escapement, which Voss considered the most elegant solution to a mechanical problem he had encountered in his career. Arnold he was more ambivalent about. Brilliant, certainly, but inclined to complexity where simplicity would serve, which was a failing Voss found difficult to fully forgive. He had views on the relative merits of English and Swiss work, on the question of whether chronometer movements should be jeweled throughout or only at critical points, on the correct frequency for a marine balance, on a dozen other technical questions that had divided the community of horologers for decades, and he expressed these views as facts rather than opinions, not aggressively but simply, with the tone of a man stating things he considers settled. Wren's education in the workshop proceeded in a way that would have been unrecognizable to any formal institution, but that had, in retrospect, a coherent pedagogy. The first phase was observation, weeks of watching, recording, listening, building a foundation of sensory knowledge about the instruments before touching them. The second phase was comparative rating, the systematic recording of each instrument's performance against the master clock, developing the ability to see patterns and anomalies in the numbers. The third phase was maintenance, learning to wind correctly, to open and close the boxes without disturbing the gimbal suspension, to clean the external surfaces without introducing particles to the movement. Only after all of this, months into the apprenticeship, did Voss permit Wren to work on a movement itself, and even then the work began with instruments that were already in need of cleaning rather than repair, where the risk of error was limited. The workshop also received visitors, shipping agents, captains, first officers, occasionally representatives of instrument-making firms in England or Germany, who came to consult with Voss on technical questions. Wren observed these visits from his position at the workbench, learning as much from what Voss said in consultation as from what he demonstrated in the work itself. He noted that Voss was different with navigators than with other craftsmen, more expansive, more willing to explain, as if he recognized in them the users toward whom all the work was ultimately directed, and felt an obligation to close the gap between what the maker knew and what the user needed to know. He told captains things they often did not expect to hear. He told them that a chronometer purchased from the finest maker in London was still only as reliable as the man who maintained it. He told them that 3 chronometers that agreed were not necessarily correct, that 3 instruments with the same error, perhaps all rated against a defective reference signal before departure, would agree cheerfully all the way to a wreck. He told them that the rating certificate was not a guarantee but a starting point, and that a navigator who did not maintain his own running assessment of his instrument's performance was navigating on faith rather than knowledge. Some of them received this information with resistance. Voss received their resistance with perfect equanimity, as a man receives weather, noting it, waiting for it to pass, continuing. He was not interested in being persuasive. He was interested in being accurate. Wren absorbed all of it. The workshop, the man, the philosophy that was embedded in every practice and every comment, all of it went into him and settled and became part of the structure of how he thought. He had come to Amsterdam to learn to set chronometers. He was learning, instead, what it meant to take time seriously, time as a physical reality, as a navigational necessity, as the medium in which precision either existed or did not, and on which, at sea, everything else depended. Segment 4. The Rating Certificate. Every chronometer that left a reputable maker's hands came with a rating certificate, and the rating certificate was not, as Wren initially assumed, a simple record of the instrument's daily error. It was something considerably more nuanced, a document that, in the hands of a maker who understood his work, encoded the personality of the instrument in a form that a careful navigator could use throughout the life of the instrument. To read a rating certificate well was to know something real about the chronometer. To ignore it, or to understand it only superficially, was to navigate with a stranger. The certificate recorded the daily rate, the amount by which the instrument gained or lost against a known standard, over a period of extended observation. But rate alone was insufficient, because rate was not constant. Temperature affected it. A chronometer that performed admirably in the temperate conditions of an English port might run differently in the tropics, where temperatures aboard ship could reach levels that expanded the metal components of the movement, enough to alter their effective dimensions, and thus their function. The best rating certificates therefore recorded rate across temperatures, providing a table rather than a single number. Rate at 15 degrees Celsius, rate at 20, rate at 25, with notes about consistency and any observed anomalies. Humidity was another variable, documented by makers who were thorough enough to test for it, which not all were. A fact that Voss noted with the controlled disapproval he reserved for professional inadequacy. The behavior of lubricants in the movement changed with humidity, affecting the freedom of the pivots and jewels, and thus the consistency of the escapement. A chronometer that had been tested only in the controlled environment of a workshop, and then deployed on a ship crossing the equatorial Atlantic, would encounter conditions of humidity it had never been exposed to, and its behavior in those conditions would be unknown unless the maker had thought to investigate it. Most captains who bought instruments from makers who had not done this testing did not know that there was a gap in their knowledge. This was, in Voss's view, a kind of negligence on both sides. Though he reserved his most pointed analysis for the makers, Voss's own certificates were documents of unusual completeness. He tested each instrument over a minimum of 6 weeks before providing the certificate, and his testing protocol covered temperature ranges from 10 to 30 degrees, humidity from low to high, as the Amsterdam seasons permitted, and positioned the orientation of the instrument in its box because a chronometer's rate could vary depending on the direction it was facing, owing to the effects of gravity on components that were not perfectly balanced. The certificate was the record of all of this investigation, written in Voss's small regular hand and organized in tables that a navigator could consult at sea, adjusting his reading of the instrument based on the conditions prevailing at his location. The certificate is a biography, Voss explained to Wren, during the period when Wren was learning to compile them. You have observed the instrument under many conditions. You have recorded what you found. The navigator who reads this document is meeting the instrument for the first time. You are introducing them. The quality of the introduction determines whether they will be able to trust each other. The work of producing a certificate required the ability Voss had identified at the outset as the first skill: listening. Not just listening to the instruments, though that was part of it, but listening to the numbers, learning to read the columns of daily rates with an attention that caught not just the magnitude of gain or loss, but the pattern of variation. An instrument whose rate varied randomly was more troubling than one whose rate changed predictably with temperature, because random variation could not be corrected for. A predictable instrument, even if its daily rate was substantial, allowed the navigator to maintain a running correction, to know that in tropical conditions the chronometer ran a certain number of seconds fast per day, and to apply that knowledge when working out the position. Wren spent his first 3 months in the workshop doing almost nothing except this rating work. He was given a journal, a bound book of good paper, its pages ruled in columns for date, temperature, humidity, and the readings of 6 instruments against the master clock, and he was told to make his entries at the same time each day, to measure temperature and humidity before recording anything, and to note any disturbance of the instruments or the environment that might have affected the readings. Voss reviewed the journal weekly, not with praise or criticism of Wren's observations, but with questions. Why had the rate of instrument number 4 changed on this particular day? What had happened to the humidity? Was there any correlation with the rate of instrument 7? Could Wren detect any pattern in the deviations that had occurred over the past 10 days? Most of the time, Wren could not immediately answer these questions. He learned to sit with them, to go back to the journal, to look harder at the numbers, to think about what might connect an observation on one day with a deviation on another. Slowly, over weeks, he began to see what Voss saw. The instruments were not simply running, they were responding to the environment, to their own mechanical condition, to the accumulated wear of operation. The numbers were not just data, they were communication, and learning to read them was learning a language. The language had grammar, daily rates that drifted steadily in one direction, gaining more with each passing day, or less, indicated a mainspring losing tension as it aged, or lubricants drying out, or a bearing developing wear. Sudden changes in rate, not correlated with temperature or humidity changes, suggested a mechanical event, a piece of debris in the movement, a pivot displaced from its jewel, a spring that had developed a crack. Rates that correlated tightly with temperature were evidence of inadequate compensation, and the shape of the correlation, whether the rate increased linearly with temperature or showed a curve, indicated something about the design of the compensation system and its current state. Every number is a question, Voss said once, reviewing the journal over Wren's shoulder. He pointed to an entry midway through the 2nd month, a day when instrument number 11 had gained significantly more than its established rate, then returned to normal the following day. You recorded this correctly. You noted the change. Now, what is the question? Wren had been thinking about it for the 2 weeks since the entry. Something disturbed the instrument on that day, he said, and only for that day. If it were a mechanical problem developing, it would continue. If it were a temperature effect, the other instruments would show something similar. But nothing else changed. Good. And the question, what was different about that specific instrument on that specific day? Voss nodded. He turned to the shelf, opened the box of number 11, and tilted it slightly. From within the movement came a sound too faint for any but practiced ears, a barely perceptible roughness in the tick that was not present in the other instruments. Debris on the escape wheel, introduced, I would estimate, about 3 weeks ago, and not yet dislodged by the mechanism's operation. He closed the box. It needs cleaning, and you need to learn that the rating is not only a record of the past, it is a diagnostic tool. You look at the numbers not to know what happened, but to understand what is happening. The distinction was not subtle, but it required a particular quality of engagement with the data to appreciate. A passive reading of the rating journal produced historical records. An active reading, one that asked questions of the numbers, looked for correlations, treated deviations as symptoms rather than anomalies, produced knowledge. The rating certificate that resulted from the latter kind of engagement was a living document, a guide to a living instrument. The certificate that resulted from the former was accurate, but dead. Wren came to understand, through this work, why Voss insisted on so extended a rating period. 6 weeks was the minimum, not because the mathematics required it, but because the instrument's personality required that much time to reveal itself. In the first week of observation, what you had were numbers. In the second and third weeks, patterns began to emerge. By the fourth and fifth weeks, the patterns were reliable enough to be characterized. By the sixth, you knew the instrument, knew its rate under various conditions, knew how to interpret deviations, knew what stability looked like for this particular mechanism as distinguished from another. The certificate you produced at the end of this period was not a summary of what you had observed. It was an introduction to the instrument itself. This was the craft beneath the craft, the epistemic practice that made all the physical skill meaningful. Anyone could wind a chronometer and read its face. Anyone could write down a number and compare it to yesterday's number. The skill that distinguished Voss's certificates from those of lesser makers was not technical so much as it was a quality of attention, the willingness to engage with the data as if it were trying to tell you something, and the patience to keep asking questions until it did. Wren kept his rating journal for all 3 years of his apprenticeship, and by the end it was one of his most valued possessions, not as a record of the instruments he had observed, though it was that, but as a record of how his own capacity for attention had developed. The early entries were accurate but thin. The later ones were dense with observation and question, cross-referencing previous entries, noting correlations and patterns and anomalies, constructing, over months of accumulated notation, a portrait of each instrument that was detailed enough to be genuinely useful. He had learned to listen to the numbers the way Voss had learned to listen to the ticking, not for what was expected, but for what was there. Segment 5. The ceremony of setting. Setting a ship's chronometer was not a casual act. In the workshops of men who understood what the setting represented, who felt in their professional bones the chain of consequence that ran from this moment of calibration out to the open ocean and the ships that would navigate. By these instruments, it was something close to ceremony. Not ceremony in the sense of ritual for its own sake, not the elaborate performance of formality that exists to demonstrate seriousness rather than to achieve it, but ceremony in the older and more practical sense, a set of deliberate, ordered actions performed in a specific way, because the specific way had been found, through experience and reasoning, to produce the best results. The seriousness was in the procedure itself. The procedure was the ceremony. The first and most critical question in setting a chronometer was the source of the time. This was, in the years of Wren's apprenticeship, a more complex question than it might appear, because the infrastructure of time distribution that we now take entirely for granted did not exist. There were no radio time signals, no GPS satellites broadcasting their atomic clock pulses to any receiver on Earth, no telephone systems through which a standard time could be communicated instantly across distance. There was the observatory, and there was what the observatory made available to ships in port, which, in the major maritime cities of Europe, was primarily the time ball. The time ball was an instrument of beautiful simplicity, designed to address a specific and serious problem: how to communicate the precise time to ships anchored in harbor, whose officers could see the observatory tower but could not enter it. The mechanism was direct. A large sphere, typically around a meter in diameter, made of wood or metal, painted in a color visible at distance, was mounted on a mast atop the observatory building. At a fixed time each afternoon, usually 1 o'clock in the afternoon, mean time at the local meridian, the ball was raised to the top of the mast in advance, then dropped at the exact moment. An officer aboard a ship in harbor, watching through a telescope, would see the ball fall and note the instant against his own watch or chronometer, establishing the error of his instrument against the known standard. The system required clear weather, fog defeated it, and it required a telescope if the ship was at any distance from the observatory. It also required the operator of the time ball to know the time precisely, which meant the observatory staff maintaining their own instruments against the stars, taking meridian observations with transit telescopes to determine local noon and thus establish the running clock. The entire chain of timekeeping from the stars, through the observatory's instruments, through the time ball, to the chronometer aboard the ship, had to be maintained with care at every link, because an error introduced at any point propagated to all subsequent points. Voss had observed the time ball from various positions and various instruments so many times over 30 years that he had a detailed empirical knowledge of its reliability, which was excellent, within its limitations, and of the various practical difficulties that attended its use. He knew which positions in the harbor provided the clearest view of the observatory tower, which atmospheric conditions introduced significant errors in the observer's perception of the ball's fall, how to correct for the reaction time that intervened between seeing the ball fall and marking the instant on a watch. He had opinions about the relative merits of different observatories. The Greenwich time ball, which had been in operation since 1833, was in his view the best administered and most reliable, and he communicated these opinions to navigators who came to him as a form of practical service, knowing that a navigator who understood the limitations of his time reference would be a more reliable user of his chronometers. On the days when a chronometer in the workshop required resetting, after service, after repair, or simply as a periodic verification, Voss's preparation began not at the workbench but the evening before. He would review the rating journal entries for the instrument, satisfying himself that he understood its current state, how it had been performing, what its rate had been under recent conditions, whether there was anything in the recent record that suggested a deviation from its established behavior. He would confirm that his own pocket watch, which he used as an intermediate standard between the time ball observation and the chronometer, was running within its known parameters and had been recently rated against the master clock. He would review the master clock itself, check its current reading against the published time from the observatory, confirm that its rate had been consistent, note the accumulated error since its last verification. All of this happened before he left the workshop to observe the time ball. The preparation was not anxious. Voss was never anxious, or if he experienced anxiety, it was so thoroughly subordinated to his practice that it produced no observable effect on his behavior, but it was comprehensive. He was constructing a chain of knowledge that would underpin the setting, identifying each link and confirming its integrity before proceeding to the next. A setting performed without this preparation was, in his view, not a setting but a guess with an air of precision about it, something worse than a frank acknowledgement of ignorance, because it produced a false confidence. He went to observe the time ball with his pocket watch already in his hand, the chain looped through his buttonhole, the watch's case open and the face visible. He would position himself. He had a preferred position on the canal bank, identified years ago as offering the best sightline to the observatory, and wait. The waiting was not impatience. He was doing something during it, maintaining a running mental track of the watch's second hand and comparing it against his expectation of when the ball would fall, so that when the fall came he was ready, not scrambled. He marked the instant, a small motion of the thumb, a mental note of the exact second reading, and began the walk back to the workshop immediately. On returning, he did not go immediately to the chronometers. He went first to the master clock and verified his pocket watch against it, making the calculation, had the watch gained or lost relative to the master clock during the period since he had last checked it. The calculation took a moment, the correction was noted, and from this corrected reading he could now establish, with confidence, the Greenwich Mean Time at the moment of the time ball's fall. This was his datum, his fixed point from which all subsequent settings would be calculated. The setting of each chronometer then proceeded with a care that was physically slow and mentally exact. Voss would open the box, observe the instrument's current reading, calculate the error, the difference between what the chronometer showed and what it should show, and determine whether the error was within the range expected from the instrument's rated daily rate. If the chronometer had been running at its rated rate, the error at any given moment was predictable from the time elapsed since the last setting. A chronometer that was rated to lose 2 seconds per day should, after 10 days, show a reading 20 seconds slow. If the error was close to this predicted value, the chronometer was performing normally. If it deviated significantly from the prediction, something had changed, some mechanical event, some environmental perturbation, something that needed to be investigated. Setting, in Voss's practice, was not simply adjusting the hands. For instruments that were running at their established rate, the setting might involve no adjustment at all, simply a verification and a new entry in the rating journal, confirming that the instrument was where it was expected to be. For instruments that had drifted from their predicted rate, the setting involved both the physical correction of the time display and the intellectual work of understanding why the drift had occurred. The physical correction, when necessary, was made carefully, with the instrument in its box and the box in its gimbal, to avoid any disturbance to the mechanism. A hand moved too vigorously, a case handled without the proper support, could dislodge a pivot from its jewel and introduce a new error larger than the one being corrected. After each setting or verification, an entry went into the journal: the time and date, the instrument's reading before and after, the error at the moment of setting, the ambient conditions. The entry was made in ink, immediately, without allowing time for memory to distort the numbers. Voss did not trust his memory for numbers, which was a form of respect for numbers, rather than a confession of weakness. He understood that human memory is imprecise in ways that are invisible to the person remembering, and that an instrument's record should not be contaminated by this imprecision. The journal was the instrument's authoritative record, and its authority depended on the immediacy and accuracy of every entry. The whole process from preparation to observation to return to setting to entry might take several hours for a workshop with 20 chronometers, and Voss performed it with a consistency that did not vary with mood or weather or the press of other work. There were days when Wren observed him setting instruments in conditions that would have discouraged a less methodical man. In the deep cold of a December afternoon, in the distraction of a deadline for a newly completed commission, with a headache so visible it showed in the set of his jaw, and the setting was performed with exactly the same quality of attention as on the most favorable days. This was not will. Exactly. It was habit of a very deep kind, the kind of habit that has been maintained long enough that it no longer requires decision-making to sustain it. That simply occurs because it is what the body and mind know how to do in that situation. You will learn to do this correctly every time, Voss told Wren, when he was first permitted to observe the setting process from close quarters. Not most times, every time. Consistency of method is the only guarantee you have. On the days when you are tired or distracted or pressed for time, you must do it exactly as you do it on the days when you are rested and focused, because the instrument does not know the difference. The sea does not know the difference. The ship that will navigate by this reading does not know what your morning was like. It was Wren recorded in his journal that evening, the most important thing anyone had ever said to him about professional life. Segment 6. 3 clocks, always 3. One of the most fundamental practical rules in the setting and maintenance of marine chronometers, a rule so basic that it was among serious navigators and instrument makers simply assumed, mentioned only when it had been violated, was the rule of 3. A ship that intended to navigate the open ocean did not carry 1 chronometer. It did not even carry 2. A ship that intended to arrive where it planned to arrive, and to understand its own position well enough to avoid the various forms of catastrophe that awaited the navigationally uncertain, carried 3. The reasoning behind this rule was not mechanical but epistemic, and it is worth tracing it with some care, because the rule is often stated without the reasoning, and the reasoning is where the real wisdom lives. The rule did not exist because chronometers were unreliable. The best specimens of Voss's era were instruments of remarkable consistency, capable of maintaining their rate within seconds per day over months of operation. The rule existed because reliability is not the same as perfection, and because even a reliable instrument provides no internal signal when it has failed. A chronometer that is working correctly looks identical, from outside the mechanism, to a chronometer that has sustained some undetected disturbance. You cannot tell, by looking at the face, whether the movement behind it is running well or has developed a subtle fault. You can only tell by comparison. With a single chronometer, you have a reading. You cannot know, from that reading alone, whether the reading is correct. The instrument might be running at its established rate, in which case the reading, corrected for known error, is reliable. Or something might have occurred, a jolt during rough weather, a temperature excursion, an invisible mechanical disturbance that has shifted the rate without leaving any visible evidence. The single chronometer cannot tell you which situation you are in. It simply presents its face, and you must take it on trust. With two chronometers, you have a comparison. If the two agree, or agree within the range predicted by their respective rates, you have greater confidence that both are running correctly. If they disagree, you know that at least one of them is wrong. But this is precisely the problem with two. When they disagree, as they occasionally will, you have no way of determining which is in error. You know there is a problem. You do not know which instrument is its source. This is marginally better than the single chronometer situation, in that it at least alerts you to the existence of error, but it gives you no basis for resolution. You are aware of your uncertainty without being able to resolve it. With three chronometers, you have majority rule. If two agree and one deviates, probability strongly favors the two. The chances that any two instruments have independently developed the same error, at the same magnitude, at the same time, are extremely small. Not impossible, but small enough to be negligible for practical purposes. The deviating instrument is almost certainly the one in error, and the navigator knows which reading to trust. If all three agree, the confidence is high, not certain, because there are circumstances in which all three could share the same error, but high enough for practical navigation. If all three give different readings, the navigator has a serious problem, but at least knows that the problem is serious, rather than navigating in false confidence. This was the epistemic structure of the three-clock system, and it was elegant in the way that good practical reasoning tends to be elegant, simple in principle, arising from clear thinking about the nature of the problem, difficult to improve upon without making it more expensive and complex. The cost of 3 chronometers was 3 times the cost of one, and the cost of a good marine chronometer was substantial. But the cost of losing a ship was greater in treasure, in cargo, and most significantly in the lives of the men who crewed it, and the calculation, properly made, was not difficult. Voss had strong views on the selection of chronometers for a 3-clock set. The ideal set was not 3 instruments of identical design from the same maker, because instruments from the same maker, constructed with the same materials and the same techniques, might share systematic errors, biases introduced by the methods of manufacture that would affect all specimens in the same direction. A temperature compensation design that worked slightly less well than intended would produce instruments that all ran fast in heat, and a set of 3 such instruments would agree with each other cheerfully, while all being wrong in the same way. The set that caught errors most reliably was one of some diversity. Instruments from different makers, potentially of somewhat different designs, representing different solutions to the common problem. Their independent errors, when they occurred, would be independent. They would deviate in different directions, and by different amounts, making the majority principle more genuinely diagnostic. This was a counsel of perfection that not every ship could follow. The economics of outfitting a merchant vessel did not always permit the luxury of choosing among instrument makers on grounds of methodological diversity, but it shaped Voss's advice to the captains and agents who consulted him. When he was asked to recommend instruments for a ship set, he made his recommendations with these considerations in mind, proposing, when possible, a combination that represented independent workmanship rather than the products of a single workshop. He also had views on the physical arrangement of the 3 clocks aboard ship, views that were grounded in the same reasoning about independent failure. The 3 instruments should not be stored in the same location, not because the storage location was likely to cause problems, but because any single event that could affect one instrument at that location could affect all 3. A fire in the captain's quarters, if all 3 chronometers were kept there, might destroy all 3 simultaneously. A jolt that caused a heavy object to fall in the chronometer box would affect all instruments in the box. Spreading the instruments across 2 or 3 secure locations aboard ship reduced the probability that any single catastrophic event would simultaneously compromise all 3. This was prudence of the most systematic kind, imagining the ways that things could go wrong and arranging matters so that those failures remained partial rather than total. Wren encountered the practical application of this reasoning during his visit to the Perseverance, and it struck him differently there than it had in the abstract of the workshop. On the brig, the chronometers were not a pedagogical example, but a material fact. 3 actual instruments. Their physical presence in the captain's cabin specific and concrete. Their boxes marked with numbers that corresponded to their rating certificates. Their maintenance, the daily responsibility of Captain Hartag himself. Seeing the 3 boxes arranged in their bracket on the specially built shelf, bolted to the frame of the ship, padded with felt, positioned away from the cook stove and the lamp, everything oriented toward the single purpose of protecting the instruments from the 1,000 variations of life at sea. Wren felt the rule of three, not as a theoretical principle, but as an expression of care. Someone had thought carefully about every form of disturbance that might affect these instruments, and had arranged the physical environment to minimize each one. There was a category of error, however, that the three-clock system was not well designed to detect, and Voss was careful to make Wren aware of it. The common mode error. If all three chronometers had been set against the same defective reference, if the time ball they had observed on departure had been running slow, or if the rating certificates they had been issued were systematically wrong, then all three instruments would carry the same error, and they would confirm each other in that error indefinitely. Three clocks that agreed were not necessarily right. They were necessarily consistent, which was related but not identical. Consistency meant that the errors, if present, were shared. Whether those shared errors were large or small, significant or negligible, could only be determined by comparison against an independent standard, another observatory, a carefully maintained astronomical observation, eventually a landfall that revealed the discrepancy between where the ship believed itself to be and where it demonstrably was. If your three clocks give you three different times, Voss said to Wren, setting down his loop one afternoon with a soft click that indicated the completion of a task, you have a serious problem, but you know that you have a serious problem. If your three clocks give you three identical times, you have reason for confidence, but you should also remember that confident men have sailed onto reefs, agreeing with themselves all the way. Wren said nothing. He had learned that Voss's brief silences after this kind of statement were not pauses for response but completions. The statement had landed where it was intended, and additional words would only diminish it. The instruments confirm each other, Voss continued, after a moment. They do not confirm themselves. That is the limit of the system. No, the limit. The rule of three was, in the end, an institutional expression of a principle that Voss applied to everything in his practice. Independent verification. No single source of information, however reliable, was sufficient. The rating was verified against the master clock. The master clock was verified against the observatory. The observatory's time was verified through the observations of the night sky. Every link in the chain was confirmed by a link that did not depend on it, so that an error in any link could be identified by the disagreement it produced with the independent standard. The three-clock rule was simply this principle applied to the instruments themselves, a recognition that no single instrument was its own best judge, and that the most reliable reading was the one that had been independently confirmed. Wren carried this principle with him out of the workshop and into every subsequent situation that required judgment under uncertainty, which was most of them. He applied it to the instruments he maintained and rated, always seeking independent verification of any reading that mattered. He applied it to his own assessments, deliberately seeking information that might contradict what he already believed, on the grounds that a belief that had been tested against independent evidence was more valuable than one that had merely been left undisturbed. He became, in the view of colleagues who did not always share his disposition, almost obsessively careful about confirmation, unwilling to rely on a single source, unwilling to accept agreement as proof of correctness, insistent on the independent check. He did not find this excessive. He had been taught by a man who knew what happened when ships got it wrong, who kept meticulous records of the instruments that had been set on voyages from which ships did not return, and who understood that the margin between arriving and not arriving was often measured in the kind of small, preventable errors that a different level of care would have caught. Three clocks, always three, and know the limits of the three. Segment 7. The gimbaled box. The chronometer did not rest flat. This was the first thing a landsman noticed upon encountering a marine timekeeper in its proper housing, and it was the thing that most clearly marked the difference between an instrument designed for life on shore and one designed for life at sea. A mantle clock sat on its base, a wall clock hung from its case, but a marine chronometer floated, suspended in a system of concentric rings that kept it level regardless of what the ship beneath it was doing, turning and tilting and plunging through its arc, while the instrument at the center of all that motion remained, within its brass rings, as horizontal and unmoved as a thought held very still. The mechanism was called the gimbal, from a corruption of an earlier word that itself derived from the Latin for twin or double, a reference to the paired rings that formed the basic system. The principle was ancient. The Romans had used it for hanging oil lamps aboard ships, so that the flame remained upright as the vessel rolled, and the same principle had been applied to compass housings centuries before anyone thought to apply it to a timekeeper. What was new, in the marine chronometer of the 18th and 19th centuries, was the precision with which the application was made and the care with which the rings were balanced, because the mass of the chronometer movement and its case had to be distributed so exactly about the pivot points that the suspension added no force of its own to the instrument's motion. Any imbalance in the gimbal system would mean that the angle of the ship introduced a net torque on the chronometer, stressing its movement in ways that would affect the rate. The gimbal was not just a housing. It was an engineering statement about the relationship between the instrument and the world it moved through. Voss had in his workshop, at various times in Wren's 3 years there, perhaps 30 distinct chronometer boxes, ranging from instruments that had come in for service to newly completed commissions, awaiting delivery to the older boxes that housed the workshop's rating specimens. Wren came to know them individually, the way one comes to know the furnishings of a room inhabited for years, not by deliberate study but by accumulation, the slow deposit of repeated observation. Each box had its own character. The older English boxes, from the early part of the century, were larger and heavier, their mahogany cases stained dark with age, their brass fittings worn to a softness that new fittings did not have. The newer boxes, particularly from the better Swiss makers, were more refined in their joinery, their hinges tighter, their felt linings cut with more precision. But the fundamental architecture was the same across all of them. The outer box, which could be locked, the gimbal rings, suspended inside the outer box by pivots let into the walls, and the inner bowl, cradled in the rings, which held the chronometer movement itself. The pivots on which the rings turned were critical elements, small pins of hardened steel, fitting into conical recesses that minimized the contact area, and thus the friction. A pivot that had developed even a small degree of roughness in its bearing would introduce resistance into the system. Resistance that would cause the rings to lag behind the ship's motion, rather than responding freely, defeating the purpose of the suspension. Voss checked the pivots of every box that came through his workshop, running them through his fingers, listening to the quality of the movement, feeling for any roughness or stiffness that indicated wear. The checking took perhaps 30 seconds per box. It was never skipped. Wren was set to this task early in his apprenticeship, before he was permitted to do any work on movements, and he treated it initially as the kind of introductory exercise given to beginners precisely because it was simple and low-risk. He revised this assessment after Voss, observing him check a set of pivots one afternoon, stopped him on the third box, and asked him what he had felt. "Nothing unusual," Wren said. "They seem free." "Seem free," Voss repeated. He took the box himself and ran his fingers along the pivot cups with the same motion Wren had used. Then he held the box at eye level and tilted it slowly, watching the inner ring respond. He handed it back. "Do it again." More slowly. Wren did it again. More slowly. This time he felt it. Not a roughness exactly, but a slight hesitation in the ring's swing. A fractional reluctance at one point in the arc that was absent in the rest. He would not have noticed it at the speed he had been working. "The port pivot," Voss said, before Wren could speak. "The cup is developing an oval wear pattern. The ring does not hang freely through its full range." He returned to his bench. "You felt it the second time?" "Yes, you will feel it the first time." Eventually, he picked up his loop. Practice is faster than instruction for this, but instruction tells you what to practice. The philosophy of the gimbal box, the enclosure of delicate precision within a structure designed to absorb and neutralize external disturbance, appealed to Wren in a way that went beyond the merely technical. He found himself thinking about it in terms that he recognized, even at the time, as somewhat abstract for a craftsman's workshop, but that the environment of Voss's practice seemed to encourage. The box was a kind of argument, an argument that precision was possible even in an imprecise world, that the disturbances of the environment, the ship's violent motion, the sea's indifference, the thousand perturbations of a voyage, did not have to penetrate to the instrument's core. You could, with sufficient engineering intelligence, create a protected space within the chaos. The instrument could be kept level while everything around it tilted. He wrote about this in his journal, in the tentative way of a person who is not sure whether what he is thinking is genuine insight or merely the inflation of a practical observation into a false profundity. Voss read the journal occasionally, not regularly, and never by announcement. Wren would simply find it on the bench one morning with a few words written in the margin in Voss's small hand. Not evaluations but additional observations, as if the journal were a conversation that continued asynchronously. Against the entry about the gimbal box, Voss had written, "The box protects the instrument. The instrument must still be well made." The box cannot compensate for poor workmanship. This was, Wren thought, a rebuke of the philosophical tendency in what he had written, a reminder that the engineering of the suspension was not a substitute for the quality of the movement it protected, which was true, but it was also, he decided after some reflection, the same point approached from the other direction, that the two things together were what mattered, the quality of the instrument and the quality of its protection, neither sufficient without the other. The best movement in a poorly made box was compromised. The best box in the world could not make a poor movement keep time. The material of the box mattered, and Voss had views on this, as he had views on everything technical. Mahogany was the established choice, and it was excellent, dimensionally stable, resistant to warping with changes in humidity, heavy enough to provide genuine protection against impact, but workable enough to be joined and fitted with precision. The brass fittings, hinges, locks, the rings and their pivot housings needed to be of good quality, because cheap brass was more variable in its alloy composition and therefore more variable in its response to temperature changes, introducing the possibility of differential expansion that could affect the alignment of the pivots. The felt lining of the inner bowl, on which the chronometer case rested, needed to be thick enough to cushion vibration, but not so thick or soft that it allowed the case to shift position, which would alter the direction of gravity on the movement. Voss showed Wren how to inspect a box for all of these qualities, how to check the joinery of the mahogany case for gaps that might admit moisture, how to verify the concentricity of the gimbal rings by eye and by feel, how to assess the condition of the felt. He showed him what a box looked like when it had been well maintained over years of sea use, the wood darkened and slightly marked, the brass fittings worn to that characteristic softness, but the pivots still clean and the rings still swinging freely, and what one looked like when it had been neglected, the pivots gritty, the rings stiff, the felt compressed and dirty. The neglected box was not merely aesthetically displeasing, it was a hazard. An instrument suspended in a compromised box was experiencing, at every roll of the ship, small stresses that were intended to be absorbed by the suspension but were not, and those stresses accumulated in the movement in ways that affected the rate. Beyond the mechanical function, there was the matter of the box's protection against temperature. The insulating properties of the mahogany case, combined with the mass of the chronometer itself, gave the movement a degree of thermal inertia. It did not respond immediately to changes in ambient temperature, but changed slowly, which meant that a ship moving from cold waters to warm did not immediately expose the movement to the new temperature, but allowed it to change gradually. This was beneficial, because rapid temperature changes were more damaging to the rate than slow ones. The movement's own mass, wrapped in the wood of the box, acted as a buffer. Some makers added additional insulation, layers of felt or other materials between the mahogany case and the outer box, and Voss approved of this practice, provided the insulation did not interfere with the ventilation of the movement, which also needed to breathe, and provided it did not add so much mass to the overall assembly that it became difficult to handle safely. The handling of the box was itself a skill that Wren was required to practice. The correct grip, one hand under the outer case, the other steadying the side. The whole thing kept level during movement, had been developed through long experience, and it was not intuitive. The instinct, when picking up a box, was to grip it as one would grip any box by the sides, or by a handle if one was provided. But gripping the sides of a chronometer box, if the grip introduced any torque, could flex the case and disturb the pivot alignment. The correct method was to support from below, keeping the box level, and to move without jarring. Voss watched Wren handle boxes in the early months and made corrections without comment, a slight repositioning of the hands, a gesture indicating a slower movement, a look that conveyed, without words, that the current technique was inadequate. By the end of the first year, Wren could move a chronometer box across the workshop and transfer it from one surface to another with a smoothness that would have been invisible to an observer, but that felt, to his own hands, as different from his early attempts as silence from noise. The box was not just a container. It was the chronometer's first relationship with the physical world, the medium through which all of the world's perturbations were either filtered or transmitted. To handle it well was to respect what it contained, and what it contained was the thread by which a ship's position was known, and by which the ship itself, and the people in it, were kept from the particular darkness of being lost at sea. Segment 8. Wind and temperature. The chronometer's greatest enemy was not water, but heat, or rather, what heat revealed, that brass, the material from which the critical components of a clock movement were made, was not a fixed substance but a variable one, expanding and contracting with temperature in ways that were precise and measurable, but that, in the early history of marine timekeeping, had no mechanical remedy. The makers of the first chronometers understood the problem in the abstract long before they solved it in metal, and the history of their attempts to do so is a history of incremental ingenuity, of designs that almost worked, and refinements that improved without quite perfecting, of the gradual accumulation of understanding about a material that behaved, when heated or cooled, in ways that required the entire mechanism to be reconceived. The fundamental issue was the balance wheel and its associated spring. In a chronometer, as in any spring-driven watch, the balance wheel oscillates back and forth at a rate determined by the restoring force of the balance spring, also called the hairspring, a fine spiral of metal that contracts and expands with the wheel, acting as the oscillator that regulates the escapement and thus the rate of the entire mechanism. The frequency of this oscillation, the number of complete swings per second, determined how fast or slow the clock ran, and this frequency was sensitive to two related thermal effects. First, as the temperature rose, the brass of the balance wheel expanded, increasing the wheel's moment of inertia and causing it to oscillate more slowly, making the clock run slow. Second, as the temperature rose, the steel of the hairspring softened slightly, became more elastic, so that it exerted less restoring force for a given deflection, again causing the oscillation to slow. Both effects worked in the same direction. Warmth made the clock run slow, cold made it run fast, and the magnitude of the effect was significant. An uncompensated chronometer might gain or lose several seconds per day for every 10 degrees of temperature change, an error that would accumulate over a voyage to something seriously damaging to navigation. The solution that became standard by Voss's time, and that Harrison had worked toward, in his own idiosyncratic way, through 4 major instrument designs, was the compensation balance. The principle was to build into the balance wheel itself a mechanism that automatically adjusted for temperature changes, so that the slowing effect of thermal expansion was countered by a corresponding reduction in the effective length of the wheel's arms, keeping the moment of inertia approximately constant. The most common implementation used a bimetallic rim. The outer rim of the balance wheel was made not of a single material, but of 2, typically brass on the outside and steel on the inside, bonded together. Because brass expands more than steel when heated, the bimetallic strip curled inward as temperature rose, carrying the mass of the rim closer to the axis of rotation and thereby reducing the moment of inertia in a way that approximately cancelled the increase caused by the overall expansion of the wheel. It was, in principle, elegant. The problem and the solution built into the same component, the material itself performing the correction through the physics of differential expansion. In practice, it was less than perfect. The compensation was approximate rather than exact, working well over a moderate temperature range but losing accuracy at extremes. The mathematics of the two effects, the change in moment of inertia and the change in spring elasticity, were not perfectly parallel, meaning that the bimetallic correction that worked at 20 degrees Celsius worked less well at 0 and at 40. The residual errors at temperature extremes were the subject of considerable effort by makers throughout the 19th century, who introduced modifications to the basic compensation balance design in attempts to flatten the error curve, to produce an instrument whose rate was nearly independent of temperature across a wider range. Some of these modifications were successful within their intended range. None was perfect across all conditions. Voss was, by Wren's arrival, one of the more sophisticated practitioners of compensation adjustment in the Netherlands. He could read a chronometer's temperature error curve, the graph of rate deviation against temperature, that his extended rating protocol produced, and identify from its shape which components of the compensation were performing correctly and which were not. A curve that was well compensated at moderate temperatures but showed residual error at the extremes had a characteristic form, as did one where the compensation was slightly too strong or too weak. He had, over decades of observation and adjustment, developed a repertoire of modifications, changes to the number, size, and positioning of the compensation screws on the balance wheel, adjustments to the effective length of the bimetallic sections that could be used to reshape the error curve. He taught this to Wren not through formal instruction but through observation and commentary. When a chronometer came in for service and the initial rating revealed a temperature compensation problem, Voss would describe what he saw in the rating numbers, trace through what it implied about the balance's behavior, explain what modification he intended to make and why, make the modification, and then return the instrument to rating to verify the effect. The explanation was always after the reading and before the action, not before the reading, because in Voss's practice, you always established what the instrument was actually doing before you decided what to do about it, and not after the action, because doing something without understanding it was simply guessing with tools. The lubricants in the movement were a separate but related temperature problem. Every pivot in a chronometer movement, every point where a rotating arbor rested in its jeweled or brass bearing, required lubrication to reduce friction, and the properties of lubricants changed with temperature in ways that affected the movement's performance. At low temperatures, oils thickened and became more viscous, increasing friction at the bearings and causing the movement to run slow. At high temperatures, the same oils thinned and could migrate away from the surfaces they were intended to lubricate, leaving pivots running dry, which at first caused them to run fast, as friction decreased, and later, as wear began, caused them to fail. The oils used in chronometer work were selected for their stability across temperature ranges. Carefully purified animal and mineral oils, mixed to specific formulations, but no lubricant was perfectly stable, and the maintenance of lubrication was one of the reasons chronometers required periodic service. Voss kept a collection of lubricants in small glass vials, each labeled in his meticulous hand, and he was particular about their storage, away from light, away from heat, away from contamination. He had strong opinions about lubricant selection for different components of the movement. What was appropriate for the escapement was not necessarily appropriate for the mainspring, and what was appropriate in the temperate climate of Amsterdam was not necessarily appropriate for a chronometer bound for the tropics. When he prepared an instrument for delivery, he noted in his written guidance to the captain the expected service interval and the conditions under which an early service would be warranted. A voyage that kept the ship continuously in warm water for more than 6 months should expect the lubricants to be in worse condition than the standard interval assumed, and should return the instruments to a competent maker's hands at the first available port. The interaction between temperature and the mechanism was, Wren came to understand, not just a technical problem to be solved, but a model of the challenge at the heart of all precision work. That the world in which precision instruments operated was fundamentally different from the world in which they were made and tested. The workshop was stable, temperate, controlled. The sea was none of these things. An instrument that performed beautifully in the former had to be understood not as a finished object, but as a starting condition, a baseline from which the voyage would proceed, altering conditions in ways that would affect performance in ways that had to be anticipated, compensated for, and monitored. This was why the rating certificate, with its tables of performance at different temperatures, was not a historical document, but a predictive one. It said, "Here is how this instrument behaves under known conditions. Here is how it has been found to deviate from ideal behavior in warmth and in cold. Here is what you should expect as you sail from the North Atlantic into equatorial waters." The navigator who carried this certificate was equipped to interpret the chronometer's readings not as absolute facts, but as data that required interpretation, data colored by the instrument's known response to the conditions at hand. A chronometer running slightly fast on a warm day was not necessarily in trouble. It might simply be behaving exactly as its temperature coefficient predicted. A chronometer running fast in conditions where no temperature effect was expected was something else entirely, and warranted investigation. The wind also mattered, though less directly than temperature. A gale that drove a ship through sea conditions of unusual violence, waves that pitched and rolled the vessel through, angles and accelerations beyond what fair weather produced, subjected the chronometer to stresses that its gimbal suspension was designed to absorb, but could not fully eliminate. A sufficiently violent sea could, in extreme cases, cause the inner ring of the gimbal to strike the outer ring, transmitting a shock directly to the chronometer case. It could cause the movement itself to experience accelerations that displaced pivots from their jewels, introduced particles of lubricant to surfaces they were not intended to reach, or, in the most extreme cases, damaged the hairspring, which was fine enough to be distorted by forces that would seem trivial applied to any other component. Voss made it a practice to examine instruments that had been through particularly severe weather before trusting their ratings to continue as established, because deposing the parent because standardly stable, because a movement of a panorage, mekander verstandigend. Becamden, but apparent in a standard stand. In a besteribus semus sand of comparent scans, sand goes to Bellison, kak cook, bird, gan require to huo, gaha and to whip of paft, with suck of porwika, or a sow with whip a sow with wick, whoopik up up, what would a papa to hoop wahwa the self, will was ask, go a cow, call got looks cool, was this Nissus cat left wook up with asked good voice, because kissed voices the wokapush, was about scuffed with the because this must You cannot know the instrument's history from its face, he told Wren. During an examination of a chronometer that had survived a notable winter passage through the channel, the movement appeared undamaged. The pivots were free, the escapement was functioning, the balance was swinging with its characteristic regularity, and yet the rate, compared to the pre-voyage rating, had shifted by 3 seconds per day. Something had changed, something so small as to be invisible to inspection, but large enough to appear in the numbers. Wren asked what he thought had happened. Voss turned the movement under his loupe for a long moment. The hairspring, he said finally, very slightly distorted, probably a single large shock, a wave, or a falling object, something that transmitted a significant transient acceleration to the case. The spring has recovered to very nearly its original shape. He set the loop down. Very nearly is not exactly. He replaced the hairspring, a procedure of extraordinary delicacy. The old spring removed, and the new one fitted and adjusted to match the balance, and rated the instrument again over 2 weeks. The new rate was close to the original, within a second per day. Not perfect, because the new spring required adjustment, and the adjustment was an approximation of the original condition, but within working limits, and the limits were now known and documented. Wind and temperature, in the end, were the constant variables, the conditions that surrounded the instrument throughout its working life, and that required from the people responsible for it a continuous and informed attention. Not panic, not obsession, but the kind of steady watchfulness that knew what it was looking for, recognized what it found, and responded with appropriate action. The chronometer kept time, within the limits of its design and the conditions of its service. The navigator and the maker together kept watch over the chronometer, compensating for what could be compensated and documenting what could not. It was, as with most things in Voss's practice, a collaboration, human intelligence and mechanical precision, each doing what the other could not. Segment 9. The Voyage of the Perseverance. In the autumn of Wren's second year with Voss, a commission arrived that was larger than most. 3 chronometers for the merchant brig Perseverance, fitting out in the Amsterdam roads for a voyage to the East Indies via the Cape of Good Hope. The instruments had been in the workshop for 60 weeks of final rating and preparation. 2 of them were newly completed commissions. The third a fine older instrument that the shipping company had sent to Voss for recertification before the voyage, and they were now ready for installation aboard the ship. Voss, who did not ordinarily deliver instruments himself, had been asked to do so in this instance because the captain of the Perseverance was a man he respected, and because the voyage was long enough and the consequences of any error significant enough that he wanted to speak directly to the officer responsible for the chronometer's maintenance. He took Wren with him. It was Wren's first time aboard a working vessel since he had left the sea to come to Amsterdam, and the return to the ship's environment was more complex than simple nostalgia. He had changed in ways that he had not, until that afternoon on the Perseverance's deck, had occasion to measure. He had spent nearly 2 years in close proximity to instruments that navigators used daily, learning what they required and what they could do and what they could not. And he now looked at the familiar world of a ship in active preparation with a different layer of perception than he had carried when he worked aboard ships himself. He saw not just the deck and the rigging and the cargo being settled below, but the navigation behind the voyage, the invisible infrastructure of time and position that would make this ship's passage possible. The Perseverance was a brig of moderate size, 340 tons, built for the carrying trade rather than speed, with a solidity about her that suggested she had been designed to survive rather than to impress. Her captain, Cornelis Hartag, was in his 50s, with the weathered complexion of a man who had spent his adult life exposed to open skies in variable latitudes, and hands so large and scarred by work that the delicacy with which he handled the chronometer boxes when Voss produced them was startling. He was a careful man. Wren saw it immediately in the way he received information. neither accepting it uncritically, nor dismissing it, but holding it, working it over, asking the right questions. He had been sailing the eastern routes for 20 years and had his own experience of the longitude problem in its practical dimensions. He had seen ships that came home and ships that did not, and he understood, in the concrete way of a man who has navigated difficult waters, exactly what the chronometers were for. The installation took place in the captain's cabin, a space that was small by any standard, and organized with the precision of a room where every cubic inch served a purpose. A bracket had been built into the forward bulkhead, bolted to the frame of the ship rather than merely to the planking, positioned to minimize the transmission of vibration from the hull while keeping the chronometers accessible for daily reading. The bracket was padded with felt and fitted with a locking bar that would secure the boxes against any movement in heavy weather. It was, Wren noted with the eye he had been developing for such things, well designed, better than many installations he would later see on other ships. Someone had thought carefully about it. Voss installed the 3 boxes himself, checking each pivot and ring before placing the instruments, confirming that each was swinging freely and centering correctly in its suspension. He then set each instrument in turn, reading his pocket watch, which had been set against the workshop master clock that morning, calculating the current Greenwich Mean Time, adjusting the chronometer faces with the deliberateness that Wren had spent months watching him bring to this act. He recorded each setting in the rating journal that accompanied the instruments, a dedicated book, bound in oilcloth, with the rating certificates for all 3 instruments bound into the front, and pages for the daily logs at the rear. Hartag watched all of this without speaking, which Wren recognized as the behavior of a man who was actually paying attention rather than waiting to speak. When Voss finished and straightened, Hartag asked his first question. If 2 agree and 1 does not, what is the correct procedure? It was exactly the right question, and Voss answered it in the way Wren had heard him answer it before. Not just the procedural answer, which was to trust the majority, but the epistemological refinement. The majority was probably right, but the navigator should make a note of the disagreement and investigate its cause, and should not simply discard the deviating reading without understanding why it deviated. A chronometer that had developed a new rate was telling you something. The question was what? Hartag nodded slowly. He had, Wren suspected, already known the procedural answer. He wanted to know whether Voss understood what he was talking about, wanted to test the depth of the knowledge behind the instruments. He went on to ask about temperature effects, about the expected behavior of the instruments in tropical waters compared to the rating conditions in Amsterdam, about what signs in the daily readings would indicate that an instrument needed service before its scheduled maintenance interval. Voss answered each question with his characteristic completeness, no unnecessary elaboration, no simplification, but nothing withheld that was relevant. The daily maintenance ritual that Hartag then described confirmed what Voss had said was necessary. Every morning, before any other duty, he opened the chronometer box and read each instrument, recording the reading and the ambient temperature in the log. He compared each day's readings against the previous, calculating the implied rate for the past 24 hours and comparing it against the certified rate. Any deviation beyond a threshold he had established, based on the instrument's certified rates and his own experience, was noted and investigated before it was accepted. He wound each instrument at the same time each day, 7 o'clock in the morning, after the readings, using the dedicated winding key that was kept in the chronometer box itself and never used for any other purpose. The winding key, Hartag said, producing it for Voss's inspection, a small, elegantly made instrument in steel, fitted with a handle designed to limit the torque that could be applied, preventing the mainspring from being wound beyond its safe tension. I have seen men use makeshift keys when the proper one was mislaid. I have prohibited this on any ship I command. Voss examined the key and returned it without comment, which was approval. It was the winding that Wren watched with the greatest attention. When Hartag demonstrated it, the care with which the captain engaged the key with the chronometer's winding arbor, the smoothness and evenness of the winding motion, the absolute absence of any jerk or variation in the force applied. The mainspring of a marine chronometer needed to be maintained within a specific range of tension, wound sufficiently to ensure consistent force delivery throughout the day, but not wound so tightly as to stress the spring beyond its designed limits. A spring wound too far, over time, would develop fatigue and eventually fail, with consequences for the rate that would be, at minimum, disruptive. A spring wound inconsistently, sometimes tighter, sometimes looser, would produce rate variations that complicated the rating picture. The goal was consistency, the same winding, at the same time, every day, producing the same spring tension and thus the same driving force on the mechanism. Heart-egg wound with the attention of a surgeon. It was one of the things, Wren thought, that distinguished a captain who truly understood his chronometers from one who merely owned them. The instrument was not merely a piece of equipment to be operated, it was a relationship, maintained through daily acts of care, and the quality of that care was audible in the rate, in the stability of the numbers, in the confidence with which a position could be derived from the reading. After the installation and the conversation, Heart-egg took Wren and Voss up to the deck to see the ship's navigation equipment, the sextants, the charts, the altitude tables, and to look out at the harbour, where a dozen other vessels were anchored or moored in various stages of preparation for their own departures. Wren stood at the rail and looked at those ships with an eye that was no longer simply that of a man who had sailed in vessels like them. He saw each ship, now, as a system of time and position, carrying within it, in the captain's cabin, the instruments that would make its navigation possible. Some of those ships would have excellent chronometers, well maintained, in the hands of officers who understood what they had. Others would have instruments of lesser quality, or instruments in good condition but maintained without proper understanding, or instruments that were perfectly adequate but connected to a chain of time verification that had a weak link somewhere. He could not see any of this from the rail. He could only know that the variation existed, and feel, standing there in the sharp autumn air, with the harbour moving and ticking around him, the weight of what that variation meant. The sea did not grade on a curve. It did not make allowances for inadequate equipment or insufficient understanding. A ship that did not know where it was lost, in the most consequential possible sense of that word, regardless of the quality of its intentions or the abilities of its crew in all other respects. Voss said nothing during this time on deck. He stood at the rail and looked at the harbour with an expression that Wren could not fully read. Not satisfaction, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The instruments were installed. The captain was competent and informed. The chain from the workshop to the voyage was as complete and sound as Voss could make it. The Perseverance sailed 3 days later. Wren watched her from the canal bank in the early morning as she moved down the harbour under topsails. She was a solid, unremarkable ship, which was, he had come to understand, the highest compliment a working vessel could receive. He thought of the chronometers in Heart-egg's cabin, swinging in their gimbals, ticking through the departure and the first miles of open water, and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite reassurance, but that contained elements of both. The satisfaction of a craftsman who knows that his work is good and has been placed in good hands, and the quieter, harder-won satisfaction of knowing what that work is for. Segment 10. What the numbers mean. The chronometer told you where you were, but only if you knew how to speak its language. And the language was not simply the reading of a face, but a chain of reasoning that moved from the instruments. Display through calculation and comparison to a point marked on a chart, a point that represented the ship's position on the surface of the rotating Earth. To know how to read a chronometer was one skill. To know what the reading meant in geographical terms. To feel, in the number, the sea it described, and the land it implied or excluded, was a different and deeper skill. One that Voss insisted Wren acquire, not just as procedure but as intuition. The calculation itself was not complex. Local apparent noon, the moment when the sun reached its highest point in the sky at the ship's location, could be determined by sextant observation. The navigator tracked the sun's altitude through its daily arc, noting when it stopped rising and began to descend, and recorded the exact time on the chronometer at that moment. That time was the Greenwich time of local noon. From the known relationship between time and longitude, 1 hour equals 15 degrees, 4 minutes equals 1 degree, 4 seconds equals 1 minute of arc. The navigator calculated the difference between local noon and Greenwich noon, and that difference gave the longitude. East of Greenwich, local noon came before noon at Greenwich. West, it came after. The direction and magnitude of the difference placed the ship on a specific meridian. The elegance of this calculation was that it required very little: a sextant, a horizon, a chronometer, and the arithmetic. The sextant could determine local noon to within a fraction of a minute of arc in competent hands. The chronometer, if properly rated and maintained, gave Greenwich time to within seconds. The resulting longitude could, under good conditions, be accurate to within a few miles, a precision that would have seemed miraculous to navigators of the previous century. who had crossed oceans with no reliable method of fixing their east-west position at all. But the calculation, to be useful, had to be embedded in an understanding of what the numbers meant geographically. This was what Voss's exercises for Wren were designed to develop. He would give Wren a hypothetical, a chronometer reading at local noon, a date, and ask Wren to determine the longitude, and then to describe where, on the ocean, that longitude placed the ship, not merely to state the number of degrees, but to place the position in the context of the geography, what coasts were nearby, what hazards might exist, what the position implied for the ship's safety, and for the next stage of the navigation. Initially, Wren worked through these exercises with charts spread on the workshop table, translating the numbers into positions, and then reading the geography from the chart in the conventional way. Voss pushed him to internalize it, to develop, through the repetition of many exercises across many areas of ocean, a mental geography that he could consult without reference to paper. The positions of the major ocean basins, the coasts that defined them, the reefs and shoals and islands that required specific attention. These should be known, not looked up. A navigator who had to consult a chart to know whether a given longitude placed him in safe water or dangerous proximity to land was a navigator who was always one step behind the situation. The Atlantic became familiar to him first, because the Atlantic was the ocean he knew from his own sailing experience, and because Voss's exercises naturally began in the areas most relevant to the trade routes served by the ships that came to the workshop. He learned the longitude of the Azores to within a degree, the longitude of the Cape Verde Islands, the longitude of the Canaries, the specific longitudes of the major hazards, the Goodwin Sands, Ushanti, the rocks off the southwest coast of Ireland that had taken so many vessels trying to make an Atlantic passage in bad weather. He learned not just the numbers but the character of each location. Ushant was a danger to ships making for the channel in poor visibility, because a ship that believed itself farther west than it was, that believed the French coast was a comfortable day's sailing away, might find itself among rocks it had not expected. The chronometer error that produced that false belief, the seconds per day that accumulated over a crossing until they represented miles, had a specific geography. It did not simply make the ship wrong in the abstract. It made the ship wrong in a specific direction, by a specific amount, in waters where that specific direction and amount mattered for specific reasons. This was what Wren came to mean when he said, later in his career, that he had learned to feel the geography behind the arithmetic. The numbers on the chronometer face were not abstract. They were coastal, they were oceanic, they were dangerous or safe depending on which numbers they were. A longitude of 40 degrees west was open water, north of the trade routes, where a ship could be hundreds of miles wrong in any direction without immediate consequence. A longitude of 8 degrees west, in the southern approaches to the channel, was water where a single degree of error, for minutes of time, the gain or loss of a chronometer running slightly off its rate, could mean the difference between a harbor pilot and a reef. Voss taught him to work through the consequences of error in both directions, not just what a correct reading meant, but what an incorrect one would mean, and how incorrect it would need to be to create a serious problem at any given position. This was not a counsel of pessimism, but of calibrated confidence, knowing not just that the chronometer was probably right, but knowing what it would take for it to be wrong enough to matter, and whether the current maintenance record and rating history made that level of error plausible. A chronometer running consistently within half a second per day of its rated rate, with a rate that had been stable for weeks, was unlikely to introduce an error of more than a few miles, even over a month's voyage. A chronometer whose rate had been variable, or whose maintenance history included a storm or a handling incident, had wider error bars, and a navigator using that instrument in waters where a few miles mattered should weight the uncertainty accordingly. The sextant sight that established local noon was itself not a trivial observation, and Voss made sure Wren understood the sources of error in the observational side of the calculation as well as the chronometric side. The sextant had its own errors, index error, which was a fixed offset in the instrument's zero that had to be measured and corrected for, errors introduced by the quality of the horizon, which was less sharply defined in certain atmospheric conditions, errors introduced by the observer's technique, particularly in the timing of the meridian passage, which required catching the instant when the sun reached its maximum altitude rather than a moment before or after. A combined error of 2 minutes of arc in the altitude observation corresponded to 2 nautical miles of error in latitude, which was generally manageable. 2 minutes of arc in the timing of the meridian passage, however, was 2 minutes of time, and 2 minutes of time was half a degree of longitude, 30 nautical miles at the equator. The interaction between the chronometric error and the observational error was the real challenge of celestial navigation in practice. Neither could be eliminated, only minimized and understood. A position derived from a careful sextant observation and a well-maintained chronometer had known manageable error bounds. A position derived from a hasty observation and a poorly maintained chronometer had error bounds that might be large enough to render the position useless for anything except the broadest course-keeping. The navigator's professional obligation was to know which situation he was in, to understand the quality of his current position as well as the position itself, to navigate not just from a point on the chart, but from a region whose size was determined by the combined errors in the system. Voss returned to this theme in many of his brief, terse statements about the practice of navigation. "The chart shows a dot," he said once, as Wren was working through an exercise. "The reality is a circle around the dot. The radius of the circle is your uncertainty. You must know the radius." He did not elaborate, and Wren understood that the elaboration was Wren's own work to do, that the statement was the map and the understanding was the territory, and that the territory could only be crossed by navigation, not by description. By the end of his time in Amsterdam, Wren could work through a noon sight and a longitude calculation in his head, without paper, and arrive at a result that he could then locate, not just on an imagined chart, but in a felt geography, a sense of where that position put the ship in the world, what it implied about the voyage ahead, what it meant for the safety of the passage. He could not always articulate the steps by which he arrived at this sense. It had become, as Voss had suggested it would, something like instinct. Not instinct in the sense of feeling without reason, but instinct in the sense of reason made fast and habitual by practice, the kind of competence that had gone underground and emerged as judgment. The numbers on the chronometer face, by the time he left the workshop, were never just numbers to him. They were always also geography, a position on the turning earth, a relationship between the ship and the coasts and waters around it, a quantified statement about where human beings were in the world and how confidently that could be said. This was, he understood, the real achievement of the marine chronometer, not the mechanical precision, remarkable as that was, but the translation it made possible, from the ticking of a spring wound movement to a mark on a chart that a navigator could trust. The language of time had been made into the language of place, and Wren had learned, in Voss's workshop, to speak both fluently and to hear the one in the other. Segment 11. The day the master clock stopped. In the third winter of Wren's apprenticeship, a cold settled over Amsterdam that was not extraordinary by the historical standards of Dutch winters, but that was by the standards of the years immediately surrounding it, severe enough to constitute an event. It came from the northeast, which was the direction from which the hard cold came in the Low Countries air that had crossed the plains of Russia and Poland without interruption, gathering a dryness and a penetration that the maritime cold from the west never quite achieved. It arrived on a Sunday and remained, with only brief amelioration, for 3 weeks. By the 4th day, the canals had frozen. By the 6th, they bore the weight of children on skates, then of adults, then of loaded sledges, and the network of ice that connected the city was inhabited and trafficked in the way the water was in kinder months. In the workshop, Voss maintained the stove against the cold with the same methodical regularity he brought to everything, banking it at night and restarting it in the mornings, maintaining a temperature that was adequate for the work, if not for comfort. The chronometers on the shelf were sensitive to this cold. Their rates had shifted, as expected, and the rating journals showed the characteristic drift of uncompensated or imperfectly compensated instruments responding to a sustained temperature below their rating range. Wren monitored and recorded and noted. Voss reviewed and said nothing, which meant the instruments were behaving within the range of what their temperature coefficients predicted, which was as much as could be expected. The master clock stopped on a Tuesday, the 17th day of the cold. They found it so when they arrived in the morning. The pendulum still, the face showing a time that was clearly wrong. The silence from that corner of the workshop, a strange negative presence in a room whose identity was constructed from sound. Wren's first response was practical. He moved toward the clock, intending to assess the cause of the stoppage, and Voss stopped him with a word and a raised hand. "Wait," Voss said. He stood before the clock for a long time, looking at it, not touching it. His face showed nothing, which Wren had learned to read as the expression of intense internal activity, rather than calm. He was thinking through the situation before he responded to it. which was his invariable practice, and which, in this instance, was more important than usual, because the correct response to a stopped master clock was not obvious, and a wrong response could make the situation considerably worse. The problem was layered. At its surface, the clock had stopped, and the cause needed to be determined and remedied. But beneath that surface lay a more fundamental problem. The master clock was not just a clock. It was the reference against which all the other instruments in the workshop were rated. If it stopped and was restarted without verification of its new time, any rates recorded against it after the restart would be contaminated. The rating journal would show numbers that could not be trusted, because the reference they were measured against had an unknown error introduced at the moment of restart. The rating certificates that Voss produced for his clients depended on the integrity of that reference. An unverified restart of the master clock was not merely a technical problem in the workshop. It was a potential integrity problem for every instrument that would subsequently be rated against it. The cold had been severe enough to push the workshop temperature below the clock's operational range, despite the stove. A pendulum clock's operation depended on the physics of the pendulum's swing, and a swing that was affected by a mainspring that had stiffened in the cold, or by lubricants that had thickened beyond the point where the escapement could overcome their viscosity, could simply slow and stop without any mechanical fault having occurred. This was the most probable explanation, and Voss confirmed it by examining the clock closely. The movement appeared intact, the pivots free, the spring wound, but confirmation of the cause did not resolve the problem of the time. "What do we do?" Wren asked, after watching Voss stand with the clock for some minutes. "We think," Voss said. He went to his workbench and opened the rating journal. The thinking, as Wren participated in it over the following 2 days, was an exercise in reasoning from constrained evidence, an attempt to establish the true time, not from a single reliable source, which was no longer available, but from the accumulated evidence of multiple imperfect sources, combined with careful analysis of what could and could not be known. It was, Wren realized as they worked, a version of the 3-clock problem applied to a harder case. The majority rules principle could not operate here, because there was no majority to be found. There was only partial information, and the question was how much time could be accurately reconstructed from it. The first resource was the meteorological log. Voss kept records of temperature and humidity alongside the chronometer rates, and these records extended back through the entire period of the cold. By examining the temperature log and comparing it to the known operational limits of the master clock's movement, which Voss knew from experience, it was possible to estimate the period during which the clock's rate had likely been affected by the cold. The clock had probably been running slow before it stopped, as the oil in its movement thickened. The question was how slow, and for how long. The second resource was the workshop chronometers themselves. They had been rated against the master clock throughout the period in question, and their rate histories, recorded in the journal, provided a check on the master clock's behavior. If the master clock had been losing time during the cold period, the workshop chronometers would appear, in the journal, to be running faster than their established rates, because the reference against which they were measured was running slow. Wren went through the rate records for all 20 instruments, looking for this pattern. It was there, faint but consistent. In the last 4 days before the clock stopped, the apparent rates of several instruments, particularly those with the most stable temperature compensation, which would be expected to be least affected by the cold, showed a small but consistent bias in the direction that would be produced by a slowly losing master clock. The magnitude of the bias was not large, perhaps 3 to 4 seconds per day of implied master clock loss, but it was consistent across independent instruments, which gave it credibility. The third resource was Voss's pocket watch, which had been rated against the master clock the previous Friday for days before the stoppage, and which had been running within its established rate ever since, protected from the worst of the cold by being carried close to Voss's body. The pocket watch provided a time anchor, a reading that corrected for its 4-day rate from the last setting, gave an estimate of what the correct time had been at the Friday reference point. From all of this, Voss constructed an estimate, not a fact, but a reasoned estimate, with explicit acknowledgement of the uncertainty at each step. The master clock had begun losing time approximately 4 days before it stopped, at a rate of approximately 3 to 4 seconds per day. Over 4 days, this accumulated to between 12 and 16 seconds of total loss. The pocket watch, run forward to the present moment and corrected for its known rate, gave a current time that could be compared against this estimate. The comparison was consistent. The two independent approaches gave results within 5 seconds of each other, which was, given the multiple sources of uncertainty in each, a reasonable agreement. Voss restarted the master clock, set it to the time he had derived, and made an extended entry in the rating journal documenting the entire analysis, the evidence used, the reasoning applied, the estimated uncertainty in the final result. He noted that the current master clock time should be considered uncertain by approximately 10 seconds. The remaining uncertainty after the analysis, and that ratings taken against it in the following weeks, should carry this caveat until the clock could be verified against an external standard, which would occur when conditions allowed the time ball to be observed again. It was, in retrospect, a masterclass in the practice of reasoning under uncertainty, the kind of reasoning that navigation required, constantly, and that was almost never discussed explicitly, because in ideal conditions it was not necessary. When the time ball was visible, and the master clock was running, and the rating history was clean, a navigator could simply set his instruments and proceed. It was in the moments of degraded information, the fog that hid the time ball, the stopped clock, the chronometer that had been through a storm, that the deeper competence was required, the ability to reason carefully with imperfect evidence, to extract the best available estimate from a situation that was not cooperating with the desire for certainty, and to know, crucially, how uncertain that estimate was. This is what it means to lose the thread, Voss said, when he had completed the analysis and the journal entry and the restart of the master clock, and was standing again before the restored and ticking instrument. You must find it again by reasoning, not by wishing, not by pretending the thread was not lost, not by proceeding as if everything is as before. He looked at the journal. You document what you did, and you document the uncertainty it leaves, and you never lose it again. He paused, and for once held the pause long enough that Wren understood something additional was coming. Every navigator, at some point in his career, will be in this situation. Not with a clock, perhaps, with a position. He will have been sailing in poor visibility, or have been ill during the period when sights should have been taken, or his chronometer will have given him reason for doubt. He will have a position that he believes, approximately, and an uncertainty that he acknowledges, imperfectly. What he does with that uncertainty determines whether he is a good navigator or a dangerous one. He returned to his bench. The dangerous navigator pretends the uncertainty does not exist. The good navigator carries it in his mind alongside the position, and navigates accordingly, more cautiously, more attentive to the indications of the sea itself, more open to revising when new evidence appears. Wren wrote all of this in his journal, as close to verbatim as he could manage. He wrote it in the voice of a person who understood that he was recording something important, not just a story about a stopped clock, but a statement about the relationship between knowledge and uncertainty that would apply, he suspected, to almost every serious situation he would face in the remainder of his professional life. Segment 12. The art passed on. Wren left Amsterdam in the spring following the winter of the stopped clock, in the middle of his 3rd year with Voss, not because 3 years was the appointed term, since no term had been appointed, but because both men understood, without explicit discussion, that the transmission was complete. There was more to learn, of course. There was always more to learn, and Wren would continue learning for the remainder of his career. But what Voss had to teach had been taught, or rather what Voss was in a position to teach, by demonstration, by proximity, by the daily practice of the craft had passed, to the degree that it was transmissible at all, from one person to another. Wren could now do the work. What remained was the work itself, and for that he needed his own workshop, his own instruments, his own accumulation of years. The departure was preceded by a period of several weeks in which the nature of the apprenticeship shifted subtly. Voss began to involve Wren in decisions rather than simply directing him, asking for his assessment of an instrument before offering his own, discussing the rating results in a register that assumed Wren's opinion was worth weighing. This was not warmth, exactly. Voss did not become warm in those final weeks, but it was a form of acknowledgement that had its own weight. The man who had watched Wren check pivot cups in the first months and found his technique inadequate now, asked him what he thought of a compensation balance that was giving slightly unusual results, and listened to the answer with the same attention he gave to information from any source he considered reliable. In the last week, Voss produced the instrument that Wren had worked on throughout his time in the workshop, a chronometer that he had been permitted to regulate and adjust and service over the course of many months, beginning with simple cleaning under supervision and gradually taking on more complex work as his competence developed. It was an English movement, one of Arnold's school, with a spring detent escapement and a compensation balance of excellent workmanship, mounted in a mahogany case and box that Wren had also prepared, checking every joint in the case and every pivot in the gimbal rings. Voss had rated it for the final 6 weeks, compiling the certificate himself, and he gave the certificate to Wren along with the instrument without ceremony and without comment, which was the highest form of ceremony Voss practiced. Wren examined the certificate. It was complete in the way that all of Voss's certificates were complete: rate tables across temperatures, notes on humidity response, a detailed characterization of the instrument's behavior in each position. At the bottom, in Voss's small regular hand, was the rating signature, Pieter Voss, Horologer, Amsterdam, and below that, in the same hand, regulated by Wren, under supervision. It was the first time Wren had seen his own name on a document of this kind, and the precision of the phrasing, not claiming more for him than was accurate, not claiming less, was characteristic of the man who had written it. They shook hands at the door of the workshop. The canal behind Wren was carrying its first spring traffic boats that had been pulled up onto the ice during the freeze. Now back in the water, moving with the particular purposefulness of vessels returned to their element. The workshop ticked behind Voss, as it always did, as it would continue to do long after Wren had gone. Through the seasons and the commissions and the visiting captains and the instruments that arrived in need of service and departed in the condition that competent care could restore. Listen to your instruments, Voss said. Correct for what you know, acknowledge what you don't. He went inside. The door closed. Wren stood on the canal step for a moment, with his bag and his chronometer in its box and the rating certificate folded in his coat. The instruction was, as he had understood since the first weeks in the workshop, not really about chronometers, or rather, it was entirely about chronometers and also about everything else, about the practice of working carefully in an uncertain world, about the relationship between knowledge and its limits, about the professional obligation to be honest about both. An instrument told you what it measured. You corrected for what you knew it got wrong, and you held, alongside the corrected reading, an honest account of what you did not know and could not correct for. You navigated from that position, not from a false confidence, not from a paralysis of doubt, but from the best estimate that careful reasoning could produce, held with the appropriate uncertainty, and revised when new evidence arrived. He established his workshop in Horology, in the town where he had grown up, and which received, by virtue of its position on the coast, a steady traffic of ships that needed chronometers, serviced and rated, and occasionally supplied. The workshop was smaller than Voss's necessarily. At first, a single room in a building near the harbor, smelling of brass and oil in the way that all workshops of that kind smelled. Lit by large windows facing the north light in the way that Voss had taught him light for this work should be arranged. He acquired instruments gradually, built his rating shelf, established his relationship with the local observatory and its time signals, and began the accumulation of years that was the only way to develop the deep knowledge of individual instruments that distinguished a master from a competent technician. His reputation grew slowly, which was the only trustworthy way for reputation in this field to grow. Captains who had worked with him once came back. Shipping agents began to recommend him, and over the years his name became one of those names, like Voss's in Amsterdam, like a handful of others in the major maritime cities of England, that represented a specific and reliable kind of knowledge, the knowledge that made the difference between instruments that could be trusted and instruments that were merely believed. He was not the best in England. He would not have claimed to be, but he was among the best in his region, which was not nothing. He took apprentices, the first within 5 years of establishing the workshop. A young man from a seagoing family, with the combination of technical aptitude and genuine seriousness that Voss had identified as the necessary condition for this kind of learning. He taught in Voss's manner, which was the only manner he knew how to teach, because it was the manner in which he himself had been formed. Observation first, then rating, then maintenance, then the slower accumulation of technique that led eventually to the work on movements. He did not explain why he taught this way. The pedagogy was the experience, and the experience was the explanation. He told the instruction, always, in exactly the words Voss had used. He told it differently each time, adapted to the moment and the student, but the substance was constant. Listen to your instruments, correct for what you know, acknowledge what you don't. He told it to apprentices in their first weeks, and he told it to experienced navigators who came to consult him about specific problems. He told it to the occasional journalist or natural philosopher who came to understand the practice of horology and its relationship to navigation, and who left, he hoped, understanding that the relationship was not merely technical but philosophical, that what the chronometer represented was an answer to a fundamental question about how human beings could operate reliably in an environment that owed them no favors and provided no certainties. The instruments he cared for and the voyages they enabled were not distinguished. They were the ordinary work of commercial navigation, cargo carried between the ports of the North Sea and the Baltic, occasional longer voyages to the Atlantic coasts, the steady and largely unrecorded movement of goods and people that constituted the real traffic of the sea. None of the ships whose chronometers passed through his hands made history, but they arrived, which was the point. They arrived because their navigators knew where they were, and they knew where they were because the instruments told them the time, and the instruments told them the time because someone had set them correctly and maintained them carefully and understood, at every step of the process, what the work was for and why it had to be done with a seriousness that matched the stakes. Wren kept his own rating journal throughout his career, as Voss had kept his, not the journal of his apprenticeship, which was preserved but set aside, but a working journal of the instruments that came through his workshop, their histories and performances, and the anomalies that required investigation. He kept it in ink, immediately after each observation, without allowing memory to alter the numbers. He kept it through illness, and through the press of other work, and through the winters when the damp made his hands ache, and the work was less comfortable than it had been in younger years. He kept it because the journal was the instrument's record, and the record was the foundation of the trust, and the trust was what a ship's life rested on. He kept it because Voss had kept it, and Voss had kept it because his own master had kept it. And somewhere at the beginning of the chain there had been a man who had first understood that the relationship between time and position required not only an instrument but a practice, not only a clock but a way of attending to the clock that was as meticulous and as continuous as the clock's own ticking. The chronometers ticked on in his workshop as they had ticked in Voss's through the years and the seasons and the visits of captains and agents and the occasional young person who had found their way to the workshop through some combination of aptitude and inclination, and who stood in the doorway as Wren had stood, hearing the sound of many instruments in agreement and feeling, in that sound, something they could not yet name. Wren showed them in. He told them to sit. He told them to listen, and to say nothing, until they could hear what the room was saying. It was, he always told them eventually, the only beginning there was. And so we arrive at the end of our voyage, 12 segments, one story, and a craft that outlasted the age that made it necessary. Elias Wren grew old in his workshop in Horology. The instruments he had learned to set and rate and listen to continued their ticking through the decades of his career, and when his hands finally grew too uncertain for the fine work, he passed his tools and his journal and the rating records of 40 years to the last apprentice. He trained a woman. As it happened, the daughter of a ship's captain who had brought his chronometers to Wren's bench for 20 years and who had watched her father's instruments receive the kind of care that she eventually decided she wanted to give herself. Wren taught her, as Voss had taught him, observation first, then rating, then the slow, irreplaceable accumulation of years. Pieter Voss died in his workshop, which was the only place any of us who knew him through this story could have imagined him dying. He was found one morning by the neighbor who brought his bread, seated at his workbench, his lute beside him, the instruments on the shelf ticking on without him as they had ticked all his life. He had made no grand statements about mortality. He had not needed to. The workshop said everything that needed saying. A life organized entirely around a serious purpose, maintained to the last with the same consistency he had always brought to the winding of springs. The sea, for its part, has not changed. It remains what it always was, indifferent, exacting, beautiful in the particular way that things are beautiful when they do not care whether you find them so. The reefs are where they have always been. The tides follow their arithmetic. The stars rise and set with the precision that made them useful to navigators for thousands of years before anyone thought to carry time aboard a ship. And they will rise and set long after the last chronometer has stopped. What has changed is us, or rather, what has changed is the knowledge we carry, the accumulation of ingenuity and care and error and correction that runs from Harrison's workshop in Lincolnshire through the rating shelves of Voss's canal house to every GPS receiver in every pocket of the modern world. We navigate now with a confidence that would have seemed supernatural to a captain of the 17th century, who crossed oceans with nothing but latitude and a prayer for longitude. We know where we are, precisely, at any moment, in any weather, in the middle of any ocean. We carry the solution to the oldest problem in navigation so lightly that most of us have forgotten there was ever a problem at all. But there was. And people solved it, not with a single brilliant insight, but with decades of patient, methodical, unglamorous work. With rating journals kept in ink, immediately, without allowing memory to soften the numbers. With pivots checked, and lubricants chosen, and temperature coefficients measured across the full range of conditions an instrument might encounter. With the rule of 3, and the ceremony of setting, and the gimbaled box that kept the instrument level while the world tilted around it. With the knowledge that precision was not a condition you achieved once and kept forever, but a relationship you maintained through daily acts of attention, winding at the same time each morning, comparing against a known standard, reading the numbers not for what you wanted them to say, but for what they actually said. This is what the methodical art of setting ship clocks was really about. Not the mechanism, though the mechanism was extraordinary. Not the mathematics, though the mathematics was the key. It was about the relationship between human care and the indifference of the world, a recognition that the world would not make allowances for carelessness, and that the only response to that recognition was to be, as consistently as possible, not careless, to develop, through practice and attention and the honest acknowledgement of uncertainty, the kind of competence that could be trusted when it mattered. Voss said it in 3 phrases, and Wren repeated them for 40 years, and they have not lost anything in the repetition. Listen to your instruments, correct for what you know, acknowledge what you don't. These are not instructions for clockmakers only. They are instructions for anyone who wants to navigate any sea, any uncertainty, any passage between where they are and where they intend to go. They are instructions for being the kind of person whose instruments can be trusted, whose records can be relied upon, whose knowledge of their own uncertainty is precise enough to be useful. The chronometers ticked on. They always did. And that, dear traveler, is where we leave the workshop. The brass and the oil lamp light, and the sound of 20 instruments agreeing about the nature of time. It has been a privilege to take this passage with you. These are the kinds of stories that deserve to be told slowly, because the people in them did everything slowly, and well, and for reasons that mattered. Elias Wren learned patience from an impatient sea. Pieter Voss learned precision from a world that punished its absence. Between them, over 3 years in a canal house in Amsterdam, they practiced an art that kept ships from the dark and people from the deep, and they did it without fanfare, in ink and brass, and the quiet ticking of rooms that most of the world never saw. If this story reached you tonight, if you listened through the cold or the warmth, the late hour or the early one, the long commute or the quiet house, then you were, for a little while, in that workshop too. You heard what Wren heard when he stood on the step before knocking. You felt what Harteg felt when he wound the springs before breakfast, when the sun was not yet up, and the harbour was dark, and the chronometers were the only certain things aboard. Take that feeling with you. It is good ballast for whatever voyage comes next. Good night, traveller. May your clocks keep true, your positions be known, and your passage, wherever it leads, carry you safely home. Until we meet again on the next one, steady as she goes.